So good morning, everybody. I don't know, does it work, the microphone, or not? Okay, good morning. So I suggest that we start our meeting. We know that there's a long queue outside, but let's get started because our agenda is quite dense today. For those of you who I have not yet met, my name is Gabriela Fesius. I'm the head of unit for coordination in DG Regio. I would also like to introduce my colleague Beatrice de Früchtenberg. She's dealing with relations with civil society, and also Romina Burlow. Before we start our agenda, I would like to tell you that this is an extraordinary meeting. As you know, our next meeting was supposed to be in the autumn. However, given the importance of the new legislative package and also of several requests from members at the April meeting to have an additional meeting, we accommodated your request. And today, as you saw on the agenda, we will have presentations from the CPR, the fund-specific regulations for cohesion policy, and also we will have speakers from DG Mare and Agriculture for the respective legislation. Just some practical arrangements. Given the last-minute arrangements for this meeting, we were not in a position to arrange translation, so the meeting will be in English. I hope this is fine for you. Given the tight schedule, we will see whether we manage to have a coffee break, or I kindly ask you to please take a coffee whenever it suits you during the meeting. And the final point on the reimbursement of expenses, please do not forget to sign the attendance list outside before leaving, because we need your original signature, as always. And please, when taking the floor for comments, please raise your flag. So with this, I suggest that we start. I am very glad to welcome with us today Erik von Breska, the director in charge of policy development in DG Regio, who has been instrumental for preparing this package for the next decade. So I give him the floor right away. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. Good morning also from my side. Welcome, everybody, to this meeting. First, before we start, I have to apologize. Why do I have to apologize? Because I have a PowerPoint presentation with me, which usually I don't like. And on top of it, it's quite a lengthy, so a long PowerPoint presentation. So I hope you are not going to fall asleep or so. But I will just focus on a few points on each of these slides. But I think it's important because the idea is a bit to present to you a bit the outline of our proposal. And then once again, we can zoom in on specific issues which are of interest to you. So let me start by telling you what, if you ask me, are like the three key themes or buzzwords, slogans, which we wanted to put forward with our proposal for post-2020, which the Commission adopted 3 weeks ago. I mean, my take is always, or what I always say is, it's first of all, we want to modernize our investments. So we want to focus in particular on innovation, but also on low carbon, so the transition to the low carbon economy. These are clearly the priorities from our perspective meaning in particular from the Regional Development Fund. Later on you will have a colleague who will speak more about the Social Fund. They will also have specific priorities, you will see. The second one, which the second buzzword or the second issue which we want to address is to make the policy simpler. Why? Because we have huge difficulties in implementing the policy right now. It's very much delayed our investments, and we wanted to bring some simplifications to our regulation. And one thing which I always point to is that the regulatory proposal which we have made is 50% shorter than the current regulation. So we have saved half of the words of the current regulation. Because at the end of the day, sometimes it's better if you delete certain provisions instead of trying to find solutions by adjusting them, modifying them, and trying to think that you can find a way around it. And last but not least, we wanted to have a policy which is for all member states and for all regions, and not only for the poorest ones or those which have, let's say, the highest unemployment levels. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what we want to achieve with our reform proposal. Once again, this you don't have to read all of that. I just wanted to briefly explain to you what is the legal architecture which we have proposed. On the left side, what you see is we have now a Common Provisions Regulation, or CPR as we call it, which covers 7 funds. Why do we do this? Because we have received a lot of complaints about the fact that we have too many different rule books. And the idea is to have a single rule book for as many funds as possible. And for example, in this case right now, also the funds dealing with migration, security, and border management, they are also going to be covered by this regulation. It's not only the cohesion policy funds. We have also merged the cohesion fund and the ERDF regulation, once again in an effort to simplify things. Here you can see specific provisions on, for example, urban development, but also on other issues. And then we have also brought some changes to the cooperation part of our budget. I will come back to this at the end. I think the most innovative proposal which we have put forward is what is called ECBM. Don't ask me what it stands for. I think it's something around the lines European Cooperation Border Mechanism or so. But the novelty, and I think I will explain this to you on the basis of an example, is that you can pull the rules, the legal rules or the law of a member state, of a neighboring member state, to your own member state for a specific cooperation project. So you can once again apply a single set of rules to a cooperation project, but I will explain to you in a second how this is supposed to function. Here, once again, you find the future policy objectives, as we call them. We have 5 of them. As I mentioned, the first one is dedicated to innovation, the second one to environment and low carbon economy. Then there's an objective on connectivity, both in terms of infrastructure, but also ICT. We have an objective which is dedicated to social rights and a social Europe. And last but not least, also a new, and this I think is quite a novelty again, a new objective which is about initiatives which bring Europe closer to its citizens. Think about urban development, think about local development initiatives, and so on. And then on the right side, what you also can see, and this is I think also very close to our heart, is that under each of these objectives, you can also promote measures to promote administrative capacity building, including of partners. So it's not only the, let's say, the ministries and the implementing bodies, it's also partners, project promoters, which can be supported in order, for example, to prepare projects and so on. So this can be done everywhere because this, I think, is still a difficult issue in many member states. And the second thing, which is also can be supported under each of these objectives, are cooperation activities. Because what we see right now in many programs is that they are very inward looking. So instead of trying to look and find partners and to team up with other regions across Europe, for example, to promote innovation in areas where one cooperates with another region or member state, we see that in the programs there's very much still a kind of an inward-looking process and priority pursuit, and we wanted to overcome this inward-looking approach. I will not go much into detail on this slide. Just let me tell you that we still have, as we have them now, so-called ex ante conditionalities, which are there to promote a proper investment environment, but we have streamlined them. We have linked them closer to our investments. We still have provisions which you find on the right side, for example, linked to macroeconomic conditionality. We are also going to link our funds more closely to the European semester. What does it mean? It means that next year's European semester, you will probably find country reports in February, March, as well as country-specific recommendations in May, which will not only be linked to structural reforms, but also be linked to investment needs and investment priorities, member state by member state, and maybe even with a regional dimension. And then last but not least, and as you see at the bottom, there's a new rule of law proposal from the Commission, but this is linked to the entire budget of the EU, not only to cohesion policy. I just want to say a few things about simplification without going too much into detail and only speak probably about those issues which are interesting for you. The first one is that we have significant difficulties with many member states on reimbursement of VAT, value-added tax, in the current period, because the regulation right now is not very clear. We see that this, in particular for small project promoters and beneficiaries, creates a lot of difficulties because we need to control the costs. We see that artificial structures are built up in order to get reimbursed and so on and so forth. Therefore, what we have decided for the future, at least this is our proposal, that all projects or operations, as we call them, below 5 million, so total value below 5 million, we will consider VAT eligible, no question asked. So we are going to reimburse VAT instead of going through all this complex machinery right now. And you can see that 96% of the current projects fall below the 5 million threshold. So this means that in particular small projects, this would be a significant reduction of the administrative burden because VAT is considered to be eligible. Whether it can be claimed nationally or not, we don't care. It's going to be reimbursed. The second issue, which I think is also quite important, is that we want to move towards an approach which is much more linked on what we call simplified cost options. What are these? These are flat rates, these are lump sums, instead of always asking for invoices and the related paperwork. And I give you just one concrete example. Right now, basically in all of the programs, we have a technical assistance budget line in order, for example, to pay salaries, in order to provide some money for monitoring of the policy, in order for paying for participation in conferences and so on. But in order to get reimbursed, obviously the related paperwork needs to be done. Think about participation lists, timesheets and so on, and all these, all sorts of travel tickets which need to be provided in order to get reimbursed. In the future, what we have proposed is that with each request for reimbursement from the Commission for a certain project, we will, without even looking into it, pay a top-up of a certain percentage, which is going to be available for technical assistance. So, for example, let's assume you are implementing a project which is worth 100 euro. We will pay you automatically, for example, in the case of the ESF, 106 euro, so 6 euro on top, which can be used for technical assistance measures. And we will not ask you for a single timesheet or for anything in order to prove that some sort of meeting or whatever has happened, because we just will go for this, as I said, lump sum approach or flat rate approach to pay for that. Why do we go down that road, before you ask me? Because we simply think that technical assistance is there to support the implementation of programs. How do you measure the implementation of programs? Well, by sending to us reimbursement claims, because if you can claim a reimbursement, it means a project has been implemented, and this means that the program is progressing. And then instead of asking for a lot of paperwork, we will simply reimburse technical assistance on the basis of a flat rate. Last point on this slide, which I think is maybe also interesting, at least for some of you who are involved in program implementation. We will differentiate the management and control system. What does this mean? It means that we will simplify the management and control and audit system for all programs, but for certain programs which are functioning well, we will even take a step back. Because how is the situation right now? The situation right now is that concerning management and control and audit, there are national rules, and on top of that, there are European rules. So in fact, those who need to implement, they have 2 rule books on the basis of which they need to work on a daily basis. In the future, for those programs which are functioning well, we allow member states and authorities and program managers to simply use their national rules. So no European rules on top of it. But we, as I said, we would only allow this for those programs which are functioning well. Maybe just one more thing which I wanted to mention here. In fact, we are not going to allow member states and regions and cities to program all the money for 21 to 27 in one go. We will freeze part of the allocation, so the money for 26 and 27 in particular, and this money will only be made available after a midterm review. Why? Because we want to have the possibility to be a bit more flexible. Flexible meaning that you do not know right now what is going to happen over the next 10 years. And therefore we want to have the possibility to reprogram and also have some money put aside. Think, for example, about the migration crisis. When the current programs were prepared and adopted in 2013 and 14, this was still before the migration crisis hit Europe. And obviously all the money was then programmed and we didn't have any, let's say, money in the pocket left in order to address this new challenge. And this made it very difficult and cumbersome to find money to address the new migration challenge, so integration of migrants. And by having such a mechanism, this would allow us to respond to new emerging challenges. I will probably not say anything on performance, just to say that we will want to move away from, let's say, paperwork once again. For example, there won't be any annual implementation reports anymore, because we want to rely basically exclusively on electronic data exchange, in particular on as regards indicators like financial indicators, output indicators, result indicators. This may be the most interesting slide for you, I assume. The first point on the code of conduct, you probably know this is part of our partnership and multi-level governance provisions. This code of conduct, which explains how partners should be involved in the programming and implementation of our programs, is going to be rolled over. What does it mean? It means that the current code of conduct we haven't touched, because it exists already now. Why didn't we touch it? Because we think it makes sense to just keep it, because then it applies immediately. Immediately means already when the new regulation is not adopted yet, because we don't know yet when the new regulation will be adopted, our proposal. This may still take months. But obviously in between, the programs will have to be prepared. And instead of waiting then or rewriting the code of conduct and then waiting until it gets adopted and then once again it enters into force at a stage which is too late to still be applicable, we thought it's much safer and it's more intelligent to keep the code of conduct in place and just roll it over, because it means it's automatically applicable right now. This means when member states are supposed to prepare the new programs, and I think this will start next year at the latest, they need to apply the code of conduct as it stands right now. The second issue, which I think is also important for you, is that we have enhanced the role of the monitoring committee. When you look at what the tasks of the monitoring committee are going to be in the future, the list is much longer than in the current regulation. And there's also an obligation to include in the monitoring committee all the partners, the socio-economic partners, which you find described in the partnership and article in our regulation. And we have also required member states to improve their communication and transparency requirements. So they need to do more about that than in the current period, because we feel that not much or not sufficient efforts are being put into making our projects and the results of our policy visible for European citizens. I will not go into that. I just maybe on the middle point, this may be there's the second bullet point here, just to tell you that in the future, the integration of migrants is going to be one of the priorities of cohesion policy. And here we have found a division of labor, hopefully, where we will focus more on the long-term needs and the migration fund more on the immediate reception of migrants. Hi, Loris. I will probably not say much about funding, but probably it's still quite good, at least to say a few words, because this is very much in the newspapers these days. So how is the funding going to be allocated by member state and region? So you see that it's still GDP per head, which is the most important criterion. So it counts for more than 80% of all the funding, which is allocated, as I said, on prosperity. Then you have a couple of indicators which are linked to labor market and education and demographics, which also play a role. And then we have included two new indicators, one which is related to climate change, and in particular about the efforts which member states have to make in order to achieve the objectives of 2030 in terms of CO2 emission reduction, as well as the integration of migrants. So basically, to cut a long story short, those member states who have received a lot of migrants and now have to deal with the integration of these migrants, they also receive a small top-up. Here you see, but I will not go into that, you see the eligibility map, so which are the regions which are least developed in dark red, then the orange ones which are somewhere in the middle, transition regions as we call them, and then you have the more developed regions in yellow, light orange. I just wanted to draw your attention to two things. First of all, what you see is that much of the South or Southern Europe is in fact turning dark red again. When you look at Spain, when you look at Italy, when you look at Greece or so, Portugal basically, all of these countries and regions have been hit hard by the crisis, as you know, and therefore they unfortunately now fall back into this category of least developed regions. On the other hand, what is quite positive, when you look at Central and Eastern Europe, you see that there's still a lot of red, but you also see right now that you have spots of orange. Look at the two Baltics, or so Estonia and Lithuania, if I'm not mistaken, parts of Poland, parts of the Czech Republic, and so on. They are slowly but surely turning, as I said, orange, which basically means that despite the impact of the crisis, they are catching up to the rest of the EU. And this obviously, and this you see on the next slide, has some implications on the allocations of our funding. When you look at our regulation, you will see that we are very transparent. We have put forward the allocations member state by member state. You see here the situation in constant 2018 prices. On the one hand, you see that the cohesion budget, go to the bottom, second, third column, that the budget has been cut by almost 10%. On the other hand, you see then when you look member state by member state that many member states are losing some money. There are only a few which receive a bit more. I've already pointed out some of them, but only at a very, very small proportion. And then on the second to last column, you see the 8 intensities. This is how we measure, in fact, the intensity of support to a member state. But there you still see that most of the Central and Eastern European countries are still the ones which have the highest support intensity among the EU 27 member states. One thing which I think you should also be aware of is that we have made a proposal to reduce EU co-financing rates. Why? First of all, because we are hopefully now leaving the crisis behind us, and we think that co-financing rates of 85% and more, like what we have right now, is not sustainable. We want that member states take more ownership again, and we go back to, let's say, co-financing rates which we had before the crisis, and therefore we have proposed, as you can see, a maximum of 70%, but going down as low as 40%. But on top of it, it's not only about ownership and leaving the crisis behind us, but I have already told you that we have also now reimbursing, for example, VAT, which we didn't do in the current period. And once again, we consider this as, let's say, two sides of the same coin. So if we reimburse VAT, then, as I said, we don't want to finance the budget of a member state, and therefore lower co-financing rates. Just a few words I go immediately here, on the ERDF regulation. What you can see here with all these numbers is just to tell you that that depending on how rich or poor the member state is, we have different requirements in terms of concentration. So, for example, if you go to the first line here of this table, you see that member states which have a GDP or GNI in this context of less than 75% of the EU average, they will need to put at least 35% of their ERDF allocations of the regional fund into innovation. This is a requirement from which they are not going to be able to escape. And another 30% into environment and low carbon economy. So basically, if you take the two together, you have 65%, and this means 65% out of 100% need to be spent on those two priorities from the Regional Development Fund. And you see on top at the bottom, we also oblige member states to spend 6% on sustainable urban development strategies. We have also excluded a number of investments from the scope of our funds. I will not go into that, but if you have questions, feel free to ask. And as I said, we have also now strengthened, I would say, the provisions on sustainable urban development. I mentioned the 6% before. We've also now proposed a new urban initiative, which is going to replace current initiatives and bundles together all let's say capacity building, innovative actions, and so on, communication activities on urban issues. On cooperation, I will probably not go too much into detail. I just wanted to draw your attention to a new component, number 5, a new strand, which is called interregional innovation investments. What is this all about? This is an invitation from the Commission to regions across Europe to submit joint investment projects for support in the area of what we call smart specialization, so innovation. It's about innovation. It's about innovation partnerships across Europe to build up European value chains, which we want to promote with this new strand or new component, which doesn't exist in the current programming period. Maybe just one more word on Interreg. All the policy objectives which I mentioned before apply to Interreg as well, but there are two more issues to which Interreg can also contribute. The first one is, you can see at the bottom under point 5, also to border management and to migration management, because clearly, in particular, the external borders of the European Union are very much affected by the migration crisis. And the second issue is that we also provide funding for overcoming administrative and legal obstacles which sometimes prevent regions from cooperation. And this takes me, in fact, to this new cross-border mechanism. What is this? And why is it needed? it is needed. I give you a concrete example here. The two cities of Strasbourg, where the European Parliament is located, as you know, and Kehl, which is on the German side of the Rhine, have tried to build a tram over the Rhine, so crossing the Rhine between the two of them. And this is a project which has been launched in the early 2000s. But the problem is that, for example, the security standards and the tariff standards and signalization standards in Germany and France are different. So you cannot just, take a French tram and move on the other side of Germany, so over the Rhine and to Germany, if the German authorities have not approved the security standards of this French, wagon or so. And with this new proposal, we allow two local authorities on two sides of the border to decide if they want to do so. They don't have to, but to decide if they want to do so, to apply the rules of one member state also to the territory of its own member state. As I said, it's linked to a specific project, so it's temporary. It's linked to a specific project, and obviously it's only also, as I said, comprises, as I said, a small part of the territory of a member state. But in this particular case, it would allow the German authorities to simply agree that the French security standards are going to also be applied and are valid on the German territory. And this is the reason why we have put forward this legal proposal, which would allow two authorities on two sides of the border to draw or to pull the rules of one member state to the other member state for specific cooperation projects. And I think I stop here, and I'm obviously very happy to take on any questions you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for the presentation, and we look forward to an interesting debate. So I suggest indeed to please raise your flags, and I see first the CPMR. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very comprehensive. Not that long, because actually it's clear that there are many other issues on the regulations. So thank you for the concise presentation. I have some comments and some questions. I hope to be brief too. Could you now guide us through the negotiations? So in which stage are we now regarding with the council and the structural working party and what's going on right now? I guess it's only the very beginning, but if you could guide us on what is going to happen now and how and when, if there is a sort of calendar. You said that the regulations are now 50% shorter, and we welcome that very much. This is something that I think everyone wanted. But we hope that in what comes next, the guidelines and so on, we keep on this effort to have clear, short, concise guidance and interpretation, because that's also a very big source of problematic once the programs are designed. Also, I would like to know about this regional perspective that you say in the EU semester, in the country reports, and then the country-specific recommendations. When are we going to know, and who decides when is this regional perspective going to be included? Because this is something that we've heard already, but when are we supposed to know this? Who decides, and under which procedure, which institutions are involved, etc. That would be very useful. And just to finish about Interreg, of course, I represent. Sorry, I didn't say who I was. Estela López Hermoso from the Conference of Peripheral Maritime Regions. And of course, we are very, very sad that cross-border maritime programs have been completely eliminated. You, of course, didn't mention that in your presentation. It was too much to focus on. But we would like to know why and how, on which grounds, cross-border maritime programs have been eliminated, because this is something that our regions, they of course they don't understand, even if we know that in transnational you can have yes, and just the last thing about the interregional innovation component. So who will manage this and how? And just the last thing, the Interreg programs, in which stage are we again with this? When are they going to be decided and in the council?
Thank you very much. CCRN, please.
Yes, hello, Geertroep of Capital Cities and Regions Network. First of all, we would like to welcome the fact that it will still be a cohesion policy for all regions. And we also welcome the idea and the principle that other indicators than GDP will be taken into account. It's also positive that the proposals of the high-level group for simplification have been, for a bigger part, been taken into account. Although we still have a little bit of fear that reporting, as it has been developed and foreseen, will be very time-consuming. So what will be done to assure that the burden won't be too heavy? Finally, concerning the budgets, that part will only be able to be attributed the last 2 years after the mid-time reviews. It raised a little bit the question what kind of projects will still be possible to be developed, because it can be a burden on long-time investments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We take one more question from Lumos, please, in the back.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, actually. In the current programming period, in the ERDF regulation, there is an ex-ante conditionality on the transition from institutional to community-based services. This is not there anymore in the draft regulation. So why is that? Why this has been left out from the text? Another point I would like to raise is linked to the excluded actions. So in case this this enabling conditions are as the ex-ante and conditionalities are called now, is not included, then at least the activity of investing in building institutions could be included under these excluded actions. Is this feasible? And finally, in the annexes, there is a table with activities and indicators. One of the indicators is linked to the number of children placed in residential units. It is very clear it is not clear for us at all. What does this mean? Does it mean that if more children are placed in residential units, this means such units will be built? Is this something positive? It is also not clear whether like placing many children in the same unit would be considered as something positive or looked at all, because from our perspective this opens a door for for building institutions and placing many children at the same unit, which would be extremely harmful for them and would go against the current EU and also international legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric?
Thank you for these questions. I am not sure I can answer all of them, but I will try to do my best. I start with the questions from the CPMR. Where are we with the negotiations? I mean, for the time being, obviously, we're not very far. What we are doing before the summer break still is to explain our proposals basically to the two institutions, to the two co-legislators, Parliament on the one hand and Council on the other. So we have quite a number of meetings foreseen where we basically just take them, the two institutions through our proposals, that they understand why we have changed certain things, and what does it mean also. So I think that's what we are going to do still before the summer break. So no negotiations before the summer break, but just more explanations. Having said that, it seems that both the Austrian presidency as well as the two rapporteurs, we have two co-rapporteurs in the parliament for the Common Provisions Regulation, are very keen to move ahead quickly. Clearly the parliament is driven by, let's say, reflections that there should still be some agreement, at least on some parts of the regulation, if not all, before the European Parliament elections will take place next summer. Because obviously, if this is not the case, then we find ourselves in a rather difficult situation, because Parliament will leave, a new Parliament will come in, Commission will leave, a new Commission will come in. So nothing will happen for quite some time. And then you don't know whether there are new priorities of these new institutions or whether they will pick up on where the old ones have left. And this would obviously slow down the adoption process inevitably. So basically the idea would be to start the negotiations as quickly as possible after the summer break, and also try as far as this is possible, but this remains to be seen, to not touch those aspects where we haven't changed much or anything, but take it a bit to a higher level, because like if we follow, for example, the current negotiations where we had, I think, 14 building blocks or blocks to negotiate with thousands of amendments, I mean, you can be almost certain that it is impossible to find any agreement before Parliament disappears. And therefore, we are now trying to reduce a bit the number of blocks to be looked at on the one hand, but also, as I said, try to find a way how we can limit a bit the modification requests. Guidelines, I mean, the idea is to get rid of guidelines as far as possible. This is also the reason why we have included quite a number of annexes into the Common Provisions Regulation, because we wanted to get legal certainty up front also. For example, we have included right now, just to take two examples, the template for the partnership agreement plus the template for the program, so that member states do not have to wait for month and month and month. How do the new structures are supposed to look like, but that they can start right away, basically as of today, because they have it in the regulation, to draft the new programs. And the idea is indeed, I mean, not to lose a single day and to move ahead very quickly with preparing the new generation of cohesion programs. And therefore, we try to eliminate guidelines and guidance as much as we can. Concerning the European semester, this is still a bit under discussion in the Commission. But I think what is very clear is that we are going to have a special semester next year. I would assume, as I hinted, that you will see the country reports, because each year in February, March, there's a country report prepared by the Commission, that this would not only focus next year on, let's say, structural reform challenges and, let's say, broader economic and fiscal issues, but also on investment bottlenecks and investment needs. And so you will probably see that the structure will look a bit different, and that maybe the Commission will then also on this basis come forward with specific investment-related country-specific recommendations, so that you have a recommendation which is not only about reforms but also about investment. And here we still need to see how we can bring in, let's say, the regional dimension. I would assume that in any case this is only relevant for a number of member states and not for each and every one. Think about Italy, think about Spain, think about Germany, or so. There you clearly see that a regional dimension makes a lot of sense, but probably not for Luxembourg or for Denmark or so. So in a sense, one needs to see this is probably going to be a bit tailor-made, member state by member state. On Interreg and why we have eliminated the cross-border strand of the maritime cooperation, well, we would probably not say that we have eliminated it. We would probably have said we have moved it into a different part of Interreg, because the idea which we have, take for example the Baltic Sea, or you can also take the Adriatic Sea or the Mediterranean or so, you have there already kind of what we call sea basin transnational cooperation program. So you have a Baltic Sea program, which kind of comprises all the countries which are located around the Baltic Sea. And our idea was that it makes an awful lot of sense to try to bring together the bilateral cross-border projects with the broader, let's say, take the Baltic Sea cooperation between member states. So that basically what you do is, you, on the one hand, you can continue with the current bilateral CBC cross-border projects, but on the other hand, you also make sure that they are embedded in a broader strategic framework, take the Baltic Sea framework once again, so that you have, on the one hand, you pool more money together and you make sure that this is part of a joint strategy of all the neighbors, as I said, bordering a sea basin. So that's a bit our view. It's not eliminating, it's more bringing things together so that they work better. On the innovative interregional investment, who manages this? This is either directly managed by the Commission or indirect management, but this still needs to be decided. One reason also why we want to do this not through shared management is that if you manage things through the Commission or by the Commission, you provide more flexibility, for example, also concerning state aid rules. Because the Commission, as you know, is not a state, therefore state aid rules do not apply. And this would mean that we can, for example, provide higher co-financing rates for these type of innovative projects. And we can also go into sectors which usually, where you immediately get into state aid problems, for example, commercialization of let's say, research projects also. So if you want to do the rollout of innovative practices or whatever, then the second you get into more things which are closer to the market, you are immediately hit by state aid rules. And this, as I said, you somehow make it more flexible if it's managed by the Commission. Then I think the question asked by the CCRN on simplification and reporting, how can I put it? Now, obviously, we still need to have some reporting. I mean, we cannot just say you do whatever you feel like, and then you come back to us after 10 years and tell us what have you achieved with the money. So on the one hand, we think that once again the current paperwork. Think about the annual implementation reports, which each year we get from each and every program, is outdated when it reaches us, because we get now the report for 2017. So in June 2000, by the end of June 2018. And then it takes us, because we have 300 programs to look at, until we do the summary. We are in autumn or so of 2018. When we then prepare a summary, this is the state of play, but it's not the state of play. It's the state of play of something which is outdated by almost a year. And therefore, once again, we took the decision that this type of, let's say, exchanging PDF files or so creates a lot of work, is completely outdated, the added value is basically non-existent. And therefore we said, okay, in the future what we want is a different approach, which is more based on submission of data. As you know, we have also the open data platform where you can see basically in real time where programs stand on our website. So this is the tool which we want to push. And we want to have then on top of it strategic discussions with the program authorities once a year, where we take stock of the situation, but no more this kind of reporting on paper thing. Now, whether you need to report 6 times, I think it was like what we proposed, or whether you go down to 4 times or 3 times is a matter of negotiation. I think, as you can imagine, I feel that member states probably unanimously will say the Commission once again completely overdid it, far too much reporting. So if we already started, say, by saying, well, you only need to report 2 times, like per year, then probably we'll end up with not at all. And therefore we thought, well, let's go for something which we think is ambitious but doable, and then let's see how the negotiations will evolve. But as I said, I mean, the idea was get away from, as I said, PDF files and so on, which we think should be more cumbersome than just transmitting, like financial data or data output data and so on. But yeah, I mean, in a sense, and maybe just one more thing on that, because I think it's also important, we want to push member states to use common indicators. Right now, most of the programs, at least our programs, ERDF programs and cohesion fund programs, they use program-specific indicators, which is fine, but it's difficult for us. Why is it difficult for us? Because it means that you cannot compare programs, and you can in particular not aggregate data. So if, for example, somebody asks us, so could you please tell us, how did you increase the productivity of SMEs by investing in SMEs? We simply cannot tell, because each program which supports SMEs uses other indicators to measure progress. And this obviously makes it very difficult for us, in particular here with the colleagues inside the Commission, to show to them what is the added value of our policy. Because if you cannot aggregate anything, if you cannot compare anything, it makes things rather difficult to sell. And therefore we want to push regions and member states to use, and you will find these indicators in an annex to the ERDF regulation, common indicators, so that everybody uses the same indicators, which would, as I said, simplify our life. I'm not sure I understood exactly what your question was on 26 and 27 or so, because you asked maybe if you...
Well, it was the fact that part of the budget will have to be used in 2026, 2027, and well, the number of choices of objectives of those programs or that could be developed in that period will be limited. So you won't be able to direct that money to long-term investments. That's our fear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this was a choice, a political choice of the Commission, because one of the complaints towards our policy was your policy is not flexible. I mean, I mentioned the migration crisis or so. You can believe me if we tell the President of the Commission and he asks us, well, you are sitting on, like a mountain of money, more than 300 billion, and then we tell him, unfortunately, we cannot support any integration measures of migrants because everything has been programmed, that this doesn't go down very well. All right, and therefore, obviously, the idea was not only for cohesion policy but for the budget as a whole to make it more flexible. I agree that obviously there are certain investments which require more stability and long-term vision. I'm thinking particularly about transport, for example, infrastructure investments. But once again, this was a deliberate choice to make. I would even agree with you that this requires or will trigger additional bureaucracy, because I mean, at the end of the day, if you need to change programs, I mean, it means modifications, approval, and what have you. But this, I think, was the price to pay. And once again, I think it makes some sense if you have a 10-year implementation period, because this is what we are talking about more or less, that you have at a certain point in time a possibility to review where are we, what can we change, are there any new priorities which need to be addressed, and that was, I think, the reason why we came forward with this proposal. I think then on Lumus' question on the deinstitutional, well, you know what I mean, deinstitutionalization, terrible word. Why is this not an ex-ante conditionality anymore? Here, I must say, I would need to dig a bit deeper. I mean, we had some internal discussions about, as I mentioned to you, reducing and the number of conditionalities on the one hand and make it more tailor-made. And but I'm fully with you that obviously this issue is also very close to our heart, and this is something which we are seriously following in those places and cases where we see problems, and we are well aware of a number of cases. And I would not exclude that this comes back in the course of the negotiations, either in an exclusion list or like somewhere else. I think so. Once again, but I would need to dig a bit deeper to find out what exactly on this particular issue led us to change the current situation. The same is true for the list of indicators. Unfortunately, I do not have all the indicators in my mind, and I would need to speak to the colleagues who prepared this. But I'm happy to come back to you, maybe in writing or so, and provide you an explanation.
Thank you, Eric. I suggest we take again 3 questions. Reves, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have 3 short questions. The first one, you spoke about the European Code of Conduct for Partnership, and that it will be rolled over to allow member states to apply it during the programming phase, which will start now. However, what will happen in 2021? Because if I'm right, it is based on a delegated act. The application is based on a delegated act, which is valid just for this programming period. So what will happen afterwards? And then a short question regarding the interregional innovation investments, in how far also social innovation is part of the objectives. And finally, something which we've been discussing already before in this group, some preoccupations. In the proposal for the MFF, it is written that member states will be able to transfer some of their allocated funds to the InvestEU fund. What are the proposed rules regarding the ESI funds? Thank you. And the link.
Thank you. Metsitis, please.
Thank you. I have too many questions to ask, but the time is limited, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So thanks for the presentation. I have to say that we are really concerned on the situation of Mediterranean cities and regions. So I think that this percentage of thematic concentration for smart specialization is not realistic for some types of cities, or medium-sized cities or metropolitan areas. We've seen that in this current period in some of the regions. But I have one comment and a couple of questions. The first one is dealing with the maritime, the elimination of the cross-border cooperation programs for maritime areas with third countries. Here, sorry to say, but the approach that you have with the Baltic is quite different to the one that we have in the Mediterranean area, where the Mediterranean program is more linked to a decentralized cooperation program and supporting the regions in these countries. We don't have too much time to discuss on that, but I want to make this distinction. Two very brief questions. The first one, do you think that the co-financing rate of 70% is realistic for European territorial cooperation, where different organizations, that ones that showing added value in the territory, can work in these programs? I'm not saying regions, cities working on that, but I mean associations, chambers of commerce, NGOs, and so on, which are really active in these programs. I don't think so. And the other one, you mentioned the issue of transparency and the involvement of more involvement of the code of conduct. I fully support that, but I don't see in the regulations proposals, maybe because I didn't have enough time to study it, how are you going to choose the managing authorities for European territorial cooperation programs? Because we are talking about transparency, but in the regulations, I don't see very much the procedure to choose the managing authorities for these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. EAPN, please.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, two brief two brief points. We've been trying to really insist on the political prioritization of the fight against poverty and social exclusion throughout the MFF, and it's kind of a political question as to whether colleagues see that the cuts in cohesion funds really represents this political prioritization at the highest level. When we see at the same time as having a cut in the policy, which has been historically one of the key key tools to fight against poverty. And at the same time, we see this increase in security funds and defense funds in border control as well. So really just a question on your take as to, is this really represent a prioritization of the poorest and most excluded in Europe? And secondly, just briefly on that point, and it's a point from the national level, is that some of our colleagues are seeing some of the monitoring committees and the processes at the national level for the next period look like they're going to be having less of a social approach, despite some of the objectives that you've just highlighted in the presentation. Is there anything that the Commission can do to kind of reinforce the objectives, the social objectives that you have, along with the other objectives at the national level as well? Because it seems that there's a bit of sometimes a risk of a breakdown of communication between here and at the national level. Thanks.
Eric, please, then we cover.
Yes, I will be much short. Yes, no, indeed. I will be also much briefer now. I start with, I think, the last question from the EAPN, and I leave most of the reply to Loris, because he is the one who is going to, from DG Employment, who will obviously have all the answers. I just wanted to say, I think one thing which is very important to retain, and this in fact is already triggering a lot of discussion in the Council, because my take right now is that Member States and also Parliament seem to be quite happy about the legal proposal. So, like the rules, if you want to say, in particular about our simplification proposal. But there's a lot of discussion about money, co-financing and what have you. And in particular, there's also discussion coming in particular from Central and Eastern European countries about the fact that the Commission has cut within the cohesion envelope the cohesion fund. And our justification was that these member states have now benefited basically over 20 years, so from 2004 to basically 2023, when this programming period is over, from a large amount of cohesion fund money, because we have inflated, in fact, the envelope for the cohesion fund artificially, because we thought that there are huge investment needs in this area of transport environment in these countries. Now what we have done is we have said we will bring down the cohesion fund in order to be able to give more money to the regional fund for innovation on the one hand, and to the social fund for education and also social inclusion, because the envelope as such becomes smaller, but where there is some flexibility is within the envelope. How much money do you give to the different funds? And the reason, as I said, was that we thought that now is the time also to focus much more in those countries on those issues: innovation, social inclusion, education, and so on. And by doing so, as I said, this allows us, for example, to increase the European Social Fund to 100 billion euro. This is what the Commission has proposed for the future. And interestingly enough, I mean, this proposal is not very well received by Central and Eastern Europe countries, who many of them still think that they want to put more money into infrastructure investments, and which, as I said, the Commission has not proposed. So what I want to say is, I mean, we try to reprioritize, in a sense, to go into this direction which you probably advocate us to do so, but there is some resistance, I think, which still needs to be overcome. But then I leave, as I said, the rest of the reply to Loris afterwards. On rabies and the code of conduct, in fact, we have not yet decided how to tackle this issue. I mean, what do we do in 2021? And how? For us, what was right now important is, given that the Commission, as I said, will launch the programming process with the European semester, starting in fact already in autumn, because the first step in the European semester is the annual growth survey, which the Commission adopts, I think, in November. Yeah. And then we have the country reports in February, and then we have the CSRs in May. We are well advised to make sure that already at this stage, the code of conduct applies. and we would be very ill-advised to withdraw it, for example, and say we propose something once the regulations are adopted. Let's worry about what to do with the code of conduct and the fact that it's a delegated act when we get there, which means in 2021. Because, as I said, what is important for us is that we want member states, when they start preparing their new programs as of next year, that partners are consulted and included in this process. And there we have the legal basis. So let's not put this in question. And as I said, let's worry about this when we get there. Whether social innovation is included in the interregional innovative instrument or whatever it's called, good question. My understanding is that what we are aiming in particular here is to support those activities which form part of a so-called smart specialization strategy. Now, smart specialization strategies, they are different from one region to another. And one would need to look what type of investments are foreseen in these strategies. Because once again, I mean, the idea is to bring together regions which work, for example, in similar areas of innovation. I'm not sure whether social innovation is part of it, because we're speaking about policy objective 1, a smarter Europe, and we have, as you know, a policy objective 4, I think, which is about a more social Europe, but to be seen. As I said, it depends very much on the smart specialization strategy of the region concerned. InvestEU, once again, this is only, in my view, a tool for us, I'm speaking about cohesion policy here, to allow us for a different way of delivering cohesion objectives. So in a sense, the way how we see it is, it's up to the member state to decide whether it uses grants or financial instruments. If it uses financial instruments, so equity, guarantees, loans, and so on, it's once again up to the member state to decide whether it wants to use its own financial instruments, so national, like instruments, or whether it wants to put some money into the InvestEU. If the member state puts some money into InvestEU, it still needs to achieve the objectives which are set out under its cohesion policy programs. But it may, for example, decide that it's much better to use InvestEU because, take a member state which has a very weak administrative capacity to manage financial instruments, they will say, we use InvestEU because there it's going to be the EIB, the European Investment Bank, which is going to run a guarantee scheme or whatever it may be in our member state. And therefore they say, for us to achieve a certain objective, we want to go into this direction, InvestEU. But so it's a delivery tool to achieve still cohesion objectives, but it's up to the member state to decide what it will use. On the question of med cities, is thematic concentration too high for certain types of cities? Maybe, I don't know. Once again, I mean, the Commission proposal is ambitious. This is also what we have said in our communication on the next multi-annual financial framework. And once again, I mean, if there are matters on where there is unanimity in Council, it's always that the Commission proposal is too ambitious. I mean, either the EU co-financing is too low, it needs to go up. Thematic concentration is too high, it needs to go down. So in a sense, I mean, this is obviously going to be the discussion which we are going to face, and we will need to see what comes out of that. On the ETC cooperation and the co-financing, as I mentioned, I would expect that this may be indeed an area where the co-financing goes up. Having said that, for external cooperation, I think we go up to 85%, if I'm not mistaken. So the 70% is for ETC programs which are not located at the external border of the European Union. And then maybe the last issue on why there is nothing on how to choose managing authorities. This is one of the biggest failures, I would say, of the current period. It's so-called the designation process. We are now in 2018, so 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and we still have a number of programs 5 years down the road which have not yet designated their managing authorities. This is completely unacceptable. Because obviously this is, like the killer argument to say this policy doesn't work. If after 5 years you're not able to designate your managing authorities, well, then you better shut it down altogether. And therefore we have said we are going to take a different path. And I must explain probably why. Because the designation is done by the national authorities, principal audit authorities. Now, if your responsibility is on the line vis-à-vis the Commission, whether the system is functioning as it is described in the program, what are you going to do? You're always going to do all the checks which are necessary, even if it's the same managing authority which has managed the program over 20 years, no changes whatsoever. So in a sense, you will never ever get out of this dilemma. And therefore we have said in the future, we are not going to look into this anymore. The member state, so the designation process is completely deleted from the regulation. As I said, this basically means that there is no such a process. When the member state submits its programs, it will just tell us this is the managing authority, this is the audit authority, what have you, and this is it. And then maybe one last point, the designation process is in fact, since it starts at the beginning, in 2014 it should have started, it starts at a point when in fact the program is not yet up and running. So basically what you're doing a paper exercise where you describe a system where there's not a single euro which goes through the system because the projects have not yet been launched. And so at the end of the day, you have, like, I don't know how many files or so just with paper description of which are not really helpful to anybody involved. Therefore, we said we dropped this all together, hoping that this would also accelerate program implementation so that we would not, lose time with designation. And if we see indeed problems, then we would ask the audit authority to run what we call an early system audit, but only at the point in time when there's really expenditure going through the system. I think I stop here.
Okay, very good. I see 6 more flags for this round. Now, just to remind you that we are continuing our discussions, and after Eric von Breska, we have here also from DG Employment, Loris Diepantrino. So I suggest that now we take 3 more questions in this round because Eric is very busy. And then we continue our agenda. So I see Anil has been having the flag for quite a long time.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks. I'm Frank Steven from Enel, and I will be very quick because I will pick up on 2 questions that have been asked, but I will expand a bit more on them. So the first thing I wanted to mention again was that partnership, I think, is really important to keep very strong into the new common provision regulation also after 2021, and I will suggest the way forward because in the thematic network on partnership, which Enel and other NGOs participate in, we did a review of the code of conduct on partnership, and we had some recommendations to strengthen NGO involvement, to strengthen user involvement in monitoring and in setting up the programs. So I think this could be a way in making sure that the partnership principle is kept and strengthened, and I would suggest just writing a better article in the common provision regulation to make sure that it is in and that it stays in, and there is no question about whether it is in or out. Because I think some things like the partnership principle, it's better to work with it, and it will take work, but it's better to work with it because then it will have better and more efficient programs. So sometimes it's better not to delete something and to find a way to work with it. Then the second point was picking up on Lumos's point on DI. I think indeed it is crucial that it is very clear that even in the future funding period, DI will become will stay a priority, and all investment in institutional care cannot be done. But I would go even further than that, and I would extend it more than it's currently in, even it was in the previous programming period, because we have lots of testimonies from many of our members that even with the current ex-ante conditionalities, investment in institutional care is still being made. And so what I would suggest is that rather than having only the enabling condition, you do also need clearly spell out a path towards the transition to community-based support, and say that you need to provide community-based services to really also support people to make the transition, not only not investing in institutions, but investing in community-based inclusive services. So there I think we need a very strong action plan as well linked to that, to make sure that we make the transition to community-based support. So rather than only looking at the numbers, also looking at the human rights of the people. And yeah, those were my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Can Europe, please?
Thank you, Mark, for the Climate Action Network. One question, a lot of praise, a few critical remarks. The envelopes, the €1 per ton CO2 exceeding. Would you be able to show what this means per member state? I tried to calculate it, but it's helpless. I think you very much welcome that you make the link to the 2030 governance process, country-specific recommendations coming from the ADCP assessment, informing programming, coming from the progress report, informing the midterm review. It's very valuable. We think it is a good opportunity together with DG Energy to get the maximum allocations for the clean energy transition. We welcome as well the fossil fuel exclusion. I think this is a very good sign to become a Paris climate compatible. However, you are still exempting gas in the transport sector. We think the gasification of the transport sector on large scale is a dead end. This has to be a zero emission strategy in a way, and this wouldn't fit. As well on climate proofing, you're including a concept of climate proofing, but this is only covering the climate resilience element. The colleagues from Connecting Europe facility and InvestEU go further. They are looking as well in the greenhouse gas emission impact on mitigation. So in a way, we would hope there can be consistency throughout all the budget. Last but not least, you mentioned simplification and result indicators. Do you think since when a lot of it is really simplistic as well. This is nominal scale, starting from zero, building 100 kilometers, new core network road achieved. This is definitely very simple, but it doesn't put it in perspective into what should be achieved with an impact outside the policy. So maybe these are the elements that we would hope could still be further elaborated in the process.
Thank you. And the last in this round goes to CEMR, and we will continue throughout the morning. Please.
Thank you for the exchange opportunity and for your presentation. I have to admit that I'm very new to this dossier, so I apologize if I made any misunderstanding. My first question is on the policy objectives. Of course, we welcome the fifth policy objective on local and territorial development, but we hope it does not mean that the other policy objectives do not include any territorial dimension. So what kind of provision do you foresee to ensure there will be a territorial dimension throughout all the policy objectives? On the revised Berlin methods, I saw somewhere there was a mention of the demographic criteria. Will that include the depopulation trends for each region? On the earmarkings of fund on policy objectives, what will be the if any, room for flexibility for the region, local and regional governments to decide on their own priorities? Because in one member state, the regions might have different priorities. And another question I have is, of course, we welcome the 6% urban earmarked on the ERDF, but we couldn't find a reference that local and regional authorities should be delegated the funds. So could you maybe clarify on that? And my last question, you mentioned the rule of law. What does it mean for local and regional governments? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think on coming back to the intervention of Enil and the code of conduct and community-based services and care and so on, I mean, our approach in the whole preparation of this package was, let's not always regulate for each and every thing in detail. So the idea was, in fact, we just are going to put in place those rules which we think, are really needed. So I don't want to say the bare minimum, but let's not try to overregulate things, and let's have enough trust also in the Commission services when we are going to negotiate the programs with the member states and regions, that these issues, I mean, like political issues, policy relevant issues, are going to be taken care of in the context of the program negotiations. So as I said, I mean, what we wanted to avoid is a situation where for each and every area we go for a long list of things, what must be done, what cannot be done, because once again, this makes the whole framework rather complex, and the idea was to have more trust, mutual trust between member states, regions on the one hand, and the Commission on the other, in order to address these issues. So once again, let's see where we will go. I mean, on the legal text, at this point in time, I cannot exclude anything. I mean, that there will still be changes to the regulation, obviously, but as I said, our approach was let's try to be a bit more flexible, and let's only regulate for the minimum which we think is needed. On CN Europe CO2 envelope, I'm also not able to do the calculation. I have colleagues who do this for me. But what I can tell you is, I mean, in a nutshell, basically, is we have said, okay, what is the objective for 2030? Where do we stand in 2016? And I understand that the reference value was 2005 or so. And basically, we have then calculated a gap, and the bigger the gap, which basically is the bigger the ambition is in order to reduce CO2 emissions, the higher the allocation. But two things. First of all, I told you, and you saw it in the slide, that the weight of this indicator is still rather small. I would have probably also advocated for a bigger weight, but this was impossible to achieve on the one hand. And then I think if you ask me right now who is benefiting, I think it's in particular those member states which have promised to do a lot, and this probably means probably to a large extent Western European countries. I'm thinking about Germany, but also other countries, because I think their climate change related objectives are a bit more ambitious than the ones which you have from Central and Eastern Europe. But I would, as I said, also ask my colleagues. On questions of exclusion or inclusion of gas and other issues, once again, I think this was something which was agreed internally, also with DG Energy and DG Klima, obviously. So once again, I would need to also speak to the colleagues why they consider this to be the most suitable approach in our regulation. I cannot tell you exactly what is behind that. On the simplification and indicators, yes, some of these things are too simplistic, but the problem which we face is that, I mean, the second you ask a member state, we want to have more reporting on specific, let's say, more sophisticated indicators, they will tell you immediately, this costs a lot of time, this costs a lot of money, and this is very difficult. So, you need to find a balance where you can still convince member states and managing authorities that they are willing to collect these kind of data and report on that. And as I said, since there's quite a lot of variety across Europe, what is feasible and what is not feasible, you need to go for something which is probably sometimes a bit too simplistic, but which is probably the only way how we can make member states move in the direction we want them to move. CMER on the territorial dimension, I agree. This cannot only be left to PO5, so to the policy objective number 5, Europe closer to the citizens, but indeed this needs also be taken care of in other policy objectives. How this is concretely done, once again, there is no legal provision for that. I mean, there are certainly some provisions, for example, that most of the funding obviously goes to the most deprived areas, in our case, which by definition means that you favor in particular those regions which are lagging behind or so, but once again, I think this is also part of the negotiation strategy. Earmarking, regional flexibility. Well, we try to make it once again more flexible by saying we will only assess the respect of the earmarking requirement at the national level. So how you do this internally, so which basically means how much each region contributes to an national objective, this is your business. And this can be more for one region and less for the other. We don't care, as long as at the national level a certain requirement is met or so. So that's the way how we look at it. Not to have specific requirements region by region. No, I mean flexibility. Member states need to just report at the national level. And last but not least, delegation of funds, I think in particular to cities. Well, I mean, one of the conclusions from the current programming period is that if we put cities in a position where they need to be part of our implementation chain, which we call implementing bodies, so that they take over some responsibilities for the management and control of our expenditure, this may work very well in Brussels. It may work very well in Berlin. It may very well work in Paris. But the second you go to countries where you are happy that there's some administrative capacity at the national level, but there's basically no administrative capacity at the regional or local level, you basically have a recipe for disaster. Disaster meaning that nothing is going to be implemented because these institutions or bodies, they do not have the capacity to implement our rules. And this meant that in a number of places right now where we wanted to go for such, let's say, decentralized approach where we rely on cities implementing funds which have been delegated to them, in fact, nothing has happened because they simply are not able to deliver on that. And therefore, for the future, we have said there are two ways you can go. Either you keep this status for the Brussels of this world, let's say, they are part of the implementation chain, or you do it as follows, that you leave, let's say, two things to the cities, which is on the one hand to prepare the development strategy, the urban development strategy, and on the other hand to select the projects. Because what is the interesting part of the policy? It's obviously to select the right projects. What is not so much interesting is to do the management verifications and the administrative checks and so on and so on. So in a sense, you leave only those bits and pieces in which really cities have a role to play and where you need to bring them in, but you leave the management then still to the managing authority, for example, but not to the city. So this is the way what we have proposed for the future, that you leave the option in order not to overburden the system. I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this comprehensive presentation, and also thank you for our partners for their rich input and thought-provoking one. I am sure that Eric is taking all this input with him. This is now a very interesting phase on the negotiations. So I hope, Eric, it has also been beneficial for you, this exchange. And I suggest we continue. Loris Di Pietrantonio is with us, and he will present to you the ESF Plus regulation and also the one on the European Globalization Adjustment Fund. Loris, we give you the...
Thank you very much, Gabi. Does it work? Yes. So let me give you a quick snapshot of the European Social Fund Plus. I will also, meanwhile, maybe even try to respond or put some accents on questions that were also addressed to Eric before, more socially or employability oriented. I will also give you and shed a bit of light on the European Globalization Adjustment Fund, because obviously these two funds talk to each other, and I will dwell a bit more on this. Now, first of all, why do we have the ESF Plus? As you certainly know by now, the ESF Plus results from 5 different funds coming together, but still answer a number of challenges which are present, not necessarily new, but some of them pronouncing themselves a bit more into the future. So first challenge is the challenge of adapting the labor force to a market which is driven by technology, productivity enhancements, globalization challenges, and which requires more and better education systems and better, more tailored skills for the future. The employment challenge still remains high, despite the fact that the macroeconomic conditions and the contexts have improved. Still, we have a lot of differences among countries and within countries, and the cohesion report stressed that out very much in terms of employability, in terms of employment rates. And if we go down to certain categories of employment, like long-term unemployed or the challenge of needs, not in education, employment and training, which touches especially the young generations. Divergences are very much pronounced, again, between member states and even more so within member states. So this challenge still remains ahead of us as a prominent challenge. Not to exclude the third challenge, the third set of challenges, which is basically the one of poverty and social exclusion. And there, again, the macroeconomic situation shows a marginal improvement. In the last years, 4.8 million have exited the at risk of poverty and social exclusion challenge, but the stock of people at risk of poverty is still very much high, 118 million people in Europe. And obviously, we need to provide an answer to that. I mean, a realistic answer is not the solution, because obviously the funds are a drop in the ocean simply because the budget, the EU budget, is a drop in the ocean. But what we want to do with the funds is to create the right conditions and the right push for those activities and measures that can help solve those challenges on the ground. The fourth set of challenges is the demographic challenge. Obviously, this is not a new challenge. It was already a challenge permeating the current programming period, 2014-2020, and even the previous one. The accent, especially in the previous periods, was an accent especially related to the aging population and the challenges related to that. But obviously now the additional challenge is the long-term integration in society and labor market of migrants, which obviously comes across as a new element in the MFF communication of the 2nd of May, and obviously the regulations related to programs. How do we do that? So what we have proposed is a fund, DSF Plus, which takes together 5 original funds, 3 in share management, and those are the ESF, the way we know it in the period 2014-2020, the YEI, the Youth Employment Initiative. This was already implemented with the rules of the ESF, but obviously was stemming from a different budget line, and obviously this was also creating some bureaucracy on the ground. We have the former FEAD, the Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived, also coming together, and these are the 3 building blocks of share management, the 3 components of share management which are within DSF Plus. Then we have 2 more programs in direct management, and those are the Employment and Social Innovation Program and the Health Program, also coming together within the DSF Plus regulation. These 2 programs are now strands of the regulation, and there is a sub-window, let's say, of the regulation which rules the direct management. So that is to say, programs and actions which are directly managed by the Commission. Obviously, the bulk of the SF Plus is still a bulk which relies a lot on the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality, that is to say, in share management. And out of 101.2 billion euro in current prices, which is the budget for the SF Plus, 100 billion are to be operated in shared management, that is to say, in full concertation and in full proportionality, subsidiarity with member states who program those funds. And following the extensive presentation by Eric, I don't have to say that you cannot read the SF Plus regulation without reading the Common Provisions regulation, which is basically the chapeau regulation for shared management. What do we do with the SF Plus? We have done a number of things. I think the most important one is the alignment to the European Pillar of Social Rights. This is a fundamental document which has been proclaimed on the 17th November 2017 interinstitutionally, so the Council, the Parliament, the European Commission, setting 20 principles and rights which are a compass in terms of policy making, both through the European semester, but also a compass for funding. Now, out of these 20 principles, not all of them are to be fundable. That is to say, not all of them require necessarily money and funding. They are operated through either regulations or soft regulation. But we identified about 11, 12 principles which are reflected in 11 specific objectives of DSF Plus regulations. And these are the specific objectives. They used to be called investment priorities in the previous programming period. Now we call them specific objectives. They are entirely aligned to the pillar of social rights. But this is not only the only basis, let's say, for DSF Plus. Obviously, DSF Plus takes on board the employment guidelines and the alignment to the European semester, which is something which you will see both in the Common Provision Regulation, but also, and more specifically, to some extent, even on DSF Plus regulation. That will come to the point a bit later. What we have done also, to some extent new in DSF Plus regulation, is a stronger focus on social innovation, on policy innovation. Now, this obviously stems from the direct management measures of the employment and social innovations trend, which obviously had already in the 2014-2020 period a vocation for social innovation. But what we also do is social policy innovation in shared management. So we put aside 200 million from the shared management envelope to be implemented in direct or indirect management to actually prop up policy innovation from the member states' side through transnationality. I will come back and clarify a bit better on this point. The other thing is actually the proposal to have policy innovation under shared management, and we try to incentivize that through a higher co-financing rate, up to 95%, for member states that engage in pursuing employability or social inclusion policies with new methods, by experimenting and obviously by trying to mainstreaming experimentation to the wider system. Then we have the health strand, and this is a component which is new in a way to the SF Plus family. But it makes a lot of sense to integrate the health program into the SF Plus, because obviously we are talking about measures which were already run under shared management and concerning innovation of healthcare systems, of care systems on the ground. By adding the direct management component, we try to close this loop of top-down and bottom-up measures related to health systems, care systems, and so on. What is also new in terms of specific objectives is obviously the objectives related to the ex-FEAD measures, the Fund for European Aid to the most deprived. Now they feature in specific objective 10 and 11. If we are curious about the regulation, this is Article 4. The list of specific objectives points 10 and 11 refer to the actions related to the former FEAD programs. And obviously the accent, the explicit accent also related to integration of migrants, which was not the case in the previous programming period. So if we dwell a bit deeper, what you will see in the specific objectives, we can regroup them according to the three clusters of the European Pillar of Social Rights, the employability clusters, the access to fair working conditions, the education and skills and training clusters, and the social inclusion clusters. I will not read these objectives one by one, but this is basically an assurance of the alignment to the Pillar of Social Rights, but also to a variety of items and measures to which member states can actually do programming for. I also want to mention two important elements. The element of horizontal principles, which is very much present in the ESF Plus regulation, especially Article 6. And when we talk about horizontal principles, which is to say principles that apply from the designing to the implementation to the follow-up of programs, all measures in the ESF Plus, that is to say not only the shared management measures but also the direct management measures. Those are the principles of gender equality, equal opportunities, and non-discrimination. And also, if you read Article 6 of the ESF Plus regulation, there is also the aim of the institutionalization very much present, and I stress that as this was also part of the questions in the previous round of questions. These specific objectives, or through these specific objectives, the aim of the ESF Plus is also to contribute to two other policy objectives as set in the Common Provision Regulations, and those are the ones of a smarter Europe and a greener, low-carbon Europe. By implementing the specific objectives of the ESF Plus, and when we talk about contributions to these two policy objectives, especially we refer to skills, employability, education, and so on. Now, not all the funding comes without strings. What we try to do in this programming period is actually to reduce the strings, because most of them were also perceived as counterproductive, administrative burden, bureaucratic, especially when you had to reflect those in operational programs and especially in amendments to the operational programs. So we reduced, in a way, the so-called concentration criteria, thematic concentration criteria. Nonetheless, we have a few which we deem are important. And those are in Article 7 of the ESF Plus regulation. Obviously, there is a general rule of complementarity with other funds. If we talk about complementarity, you have to go, first of all, to the Common Provision Regulation. You will see that multi-funding is allowed. This obviously talks about complementarity with ERDF, for instance. If you go for Erasmus+, for instance, we make explicit that complementarity is possible. It was already possible under the current regulatory framework, but only a few member states were actually using these opportunities for complementarity. Some of them also were uncertain whether this was possible. So more concretely, I can quote examples. For instance, Poland was already using the ESF to top up scholarships from Erasmus+. Erasmus Plus is the current period. Erasmus is the future program for Erasmus. That is to say, to make those scholarships more accessible to lower income pupils. There is the possibility to use ESF on top of it to some extent. We wanted to make sure that this is legally clear and that member states can actually do that. You see also these rules in the Common Provision Regulation, but also in this complementarity, the possibility of funding, for instance, through ESF, those projects which are funded under direct management. they pass the threshold. In a way, this is very similar to the seal of excellence. Now you can also do that with the Erasmus program. They pass the threshold of selection, but for instance, Erasmus doesn't have enough money to fund them. ESF managing authorities can actually decide to fund those measures and those programs. Then the other criteria of concentration is the one related to the alignment to the European semester. And this is basically a requirement for member states having CSRs, which have to be implemented through the ESF Plus, to actually set aside an appropriate amount of resources from the ESF Plus in support of the CSR implementation. Now, in this case, the usual question is, but appropriate is too vague and indefinite. So what does it mean effectively appropriate? And here the answer is that no amount fixed by the Commission would respect the principles of proportionality and subsidiarity. Only member states can actually know what is appropriate to implement a CSR, but obviously this opens the way of negotiating also with the Commission when we have to sit in terms of defining operational programs. The other concentration criteria is the part of the SF Plus aimed at social inclusion. Currently, this is 20% of the SF. Now we put 25% of the ESF. This is an aim which member states could actually reach, and it is within the ambitions of the member states, which already show percentages which are higher than the current requirement, but obviously this sets an ambition which we would like to achieve in the next programming phase. For the ex-FEAD measures, that is to say, measures related to the most deprived, this is basically basic support in terms of provision of food and basic material assistance, as well as inclusion measures for target groups which are really far away from social inclusion and especially from the labor market. The aim here is for member states to implement at least 2% of the ESF Plus resources addressing the most deprived, so honoring specific objectives 10 and 11, with an overall goal of reaching 4% of the ESF Plus implemented for these specific objectives. That is to say, at least reach a 4 billion earmarking overall for the ex-FEAD measures. And then obviously the challenge of youth. This is especially a challenge which in regulatory terms expresses itself in terms of each member state having a NEET rate above the EU average. We'll have to invest at least 10% of the ESF Plus addressing youth employment. And all these thematic concentrations will also have to be followed in terms of programming by a dedicated priority axis. Some of you also raised the questions of partnership. Obviously, we're talking about share management. If we want to deliver on the ground, partnership is the key principle for delivery, and this obviously includes stakeholders, civil society bodies, social partners, which are all important in terms of partnerships, but also the common provision regulations introduced in the monitoring committees, the relevant bodies, the so-called relevant bodies, which are also the bodies for fundamental rights, gender equalities, and non-discrimination. I think here I also open a parenthesis in complement to what Eric also said before. What we looked at in these regulations, that is to say, both in the Common Provision Regulation and the ESF Plus regulation, is to come out of a logic of principles, flagging principles. So what you miss, in fact, from the current drafting is a nice article setting a principle on partnership. But then, obviously, the result is that, okay, it was a good principle, but in terms of application, there were a lot of drawbacks which partners identified. I think what we wanted to do is something a bit more hands-on and more proactive. So I think you have to read Article 67 of the Common Provision Regulation, where obviously it talks about the tasks of the monitoring committee, of which social partners, stakeholders, bodies of fundamental rights are part. And one of the tasks is selecting the calls for proposals and projects. And this, I mean, goes much beyond having an overall horizontal partnership principle in the regulation, because it really provides the hands-on tools to be operationally partners on the ground. So I just wanted to stress these, and obviously the ESF goes a bit further, because it talks about funding with appropriate resources the partnerships on the ground. Let me go very quickly now on the European Globalization Adjustment Funds. The reason why these two funds have been proposed as separate is that the ESF Plus is more geared towards preventive measures, not only, because I mean, obviously the ESF also operated in terms of sudden loss of jobs in the current period, sometimes also complementing for the lengthy procedures of the European Globalization Adjustment Fund. But the European Globalization Adjustment Fund key vocation is to answer events that are unexpected by nature, and obviously give as quickly as possible an answer to dismissals, to sudden dismissals of people from companies. What we have modified for the future period is the scope. That is to say, not only focusing exclusively on globalization, but also on sudden changes in market conditions, driven, for instance, by technology developments, digitalization, automatization. But also we have reduced as much as possible the bureaucracy to activate the fund. That is to say, member states don't have to come up with lengthy causality-related assessments where you have to link the event to a globalization cause. But what they have to demonstrate is the amplitude of the event that creates the sudden dismissal. From 500 people dismissed, we go down to 250 people, so actions are already eligible if dismissal is of 250 people. And in terms of co-financing, the previous European Globalization Adjustment Fund was also victim of co-financing trading, because the rate was set at 60%, and for certain member states this was okay. For other member states, probably the ESF rates were actually better. Hence, there was also a mix-up between the two roles and funds. So now we use the best co-financing rates of the ESF Plus, so the 70%, which was introduced by Eric before, automatically becomes the co-financing rate for the EGF. And also we propose to shorten the time for activation of the EGF fund. They've been outside the MFF envelope. For every operation, we'll have the requirement of the co-legislators approving the operation. And I'll stop there, and obviously happy to receive a few questions.
Thank you very much, Loris, for this presentation. I give the floor to Social Platform.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have basically two questions. Well, first of all, as social platform, we welcome the ESF Plus proposal, especially in terms of its alignment with the pillar of social rights. We think that the alignment can be improved, so we will also propose some of the improved wording, especially within some of the currently presented objectives. Of course, you mentioned that the budget is a drop in the ocean. Yes, but there is, of course, it's also, of course, a tool to nudge member states into good policies, especially if it comes to social inclusion. And therefore, we think against the current challenges of Europe falling behind its 2020 objectives on reducing poverty and social exclusion, that that amount of earmarking could be further increased. Also looking at the fact that the inequalities within countries are increasing more so than the inequalities between the countries. So I think we can be more ambitious here. And also we're a little bit concerned that on the pillar of social rights, the entire chapter 2 has been put into objectives 7 to 11, while objective 7 is an unemployability objective rather than a social inclusion objective, the way it is currently formulated. So we think that an element of, while retaining the employability objective, an element of social inclusion could be added to that objective. And of course, in that respect, my question would be also, we have some concerns about the overall envelope of the ESF Plus, because we currently don't have entire clarity where specific bits would go and where possible cuts will take place, because when we look at the numbers, they don't necessarily add up. For example, the health program is slightly lower, the ESI program, what is under direct management, is lower, but as I understood, there are also bits and pieces which go elsewhere. We would like to have a little bit more clarity on that. And also, we don't necessarily reflect the ambition of the actually very, very ambitious cross-cutting migrant inclusion in ESF Plus. It doesn't necessarily reflect in the numbers. It is within the objective, it's within Objective 8, but it is not adequately matched by funding. So that is the first question. The second question would be, we have heard from the previous presentation that that there is budget line for administrative and technical assistance, but we do have, of course, a positive view of a better inclusion in the monitoring committees and in kind of like better inclusion of civil society throughout the funding process. However, what would be the way to be better included, especially if it comes to small organization on the ground, and if you go that road to really strengthen that local element, where we don't currently see the budget line for really technical capacity building, which for us is distinct from technical assistance, where you can claim meetings, etc. So we'd like to see that element increase, and we think that would come closer to the ambitions that are currently described in the CPR and the ESF Plus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. EuroHealthNet, please.
To actually really resonate what was said by the. It's not working? Yeah, it is. Okay. Okay. By the social platform. On the one hand, we're very happy with the communication that came out, the proposal on the ESF Plus, and we're very happy to see an attention to health, especially in the social inclusion. Meanwhile, we also noticed that the ESI and the health program have been reduced, and of course it looks very nice that it's 100 billion on one side for the ESF, but then we see that it's been reduced a little bit, and we have seen from the evaluations of the two programs that they have actually been very, very successful. So we think that's really too bad. In addition to that, I would like to say that we really support the attention to the European semester and the European Pillar of Social Rights, and we think this could really link health and social policies even more, because they are incredibly linked, and it's important to always remember. And in regards to the European semester, I want to raise how the last communication on the country-specific recommendations raised how health especially is one of the areas that is least implemented over the years. And now, from having heard in the last session how you can move your money from from the EU semester, or what you could have chosen it from, and then to the EU Invest. I wonder, should I be concerned that this policy area, health, which is incredibly important for sustainability of societies, that this will be forgotten, or that we should continue to be afraid that this area, which is not implemented, that this problem will continue? Thank you.
Thank you, and the CEMR, please.
Thank you. We believe that local and regional governments are also key stakeholders to the objective of the ESF that you presented. So we are wondering why they are not included in the partners in the proposed regulation. Sorry? Local and regional authorities?
I suggest we take one more question. And here I have Housing Europe, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Edith Lakatos from Housing Europe. This is the Federation of Public Cooperative and Social Housing. Thanks very much for your presentation. I would be interested in hearing more about the strand ESI, and especially the part on social infrastructure. So the proposal takes very well one of the recommendations of the high-level task force on social infrastructure to actually provide a guidance for the development of social infrastructure. So this also includes social housing, health, childcare, long-term care, and education. And I would be interested to hear more on how DG Employment is going to proceed with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Loris, perhaps.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. I'll start replying with the questions of social platform. Obviously, yes, I said the budget, I mean, the overall EU budget is a drop in the ocean, and obviously the sub-programs are sometimes even more a drop in the ocean. But obviously they create a lot of leverage effect already in the current programming. €1 spent on ESF generates at least €3 on the ground. But apart from that, I think what is important is even more the qualitative leverage. I mean, through the measures funded by these programs, in fact, we try to instill good movement and progress in member states, and this is quite widely recognized both by the open consultation that we had, but also by the studies. I mean, on your call to increase even further the 25%, if I understood correctly, I think this is for us a minimum. I think we also set 20% as a minimum of ESF for social inclusion in the current period. So we upgrade that into a minimum of 25%. And we are pretty confident that actually member states, maybe not all of them, but collectively will go above that minimum. And we'll take obviously seriously the challenge of inequalities, as you say, the challenge of poverty, which is one of the areas where obviously even the semester, as I say, the social scoreboard of the pillar, as I say, and I take the chance also to basically shed a bit of light on that, because what we see is not really separate tools, but we really see a triangle acting there together, where the pillar of social rights is on top as a compass, but then the two machines, in a way, implementing the pillar of social rights are on the one hand the semester, on the other hand the funding that have to support to some extent each other. So effectively on the implementation we really see this triangle running together and reinforcing actions in terms of implementation. Now on the specific objective 7, I mean, you may notice 10 or 11 are in a way pure social inclusion. I mean, the 10 and 11 really address those target groups which are really hard even to integrate into the labor market, although the key reason for FEAD to be joined into the ESF Plus is to create this possibility of continuity of actions. While specific objective 7 talks about social inclusion, but obviously more with a spin towards employability. Now, the idea of these 3 funds in share management, 5 if I also count the 2 direct management strands to come together, is really to create a platform for a life course approach. So effectively using programs in a way to design services and measures where potentially you could really consider every steps and challenges in a life course approach as tackable and possible through programming and implementation. You spoke about the migrant. I mean, obviously migrants become part of the specific objectives. They are recognized in a way as a specific challenge. Now, the truth of the matter is that the MFF was the way that it was, with a limited budget. The increase especially went on to the emergency funding, especially the AMIF-related funds. The ESF already was taking care of the migration challenge. A number of member states were able, even without reprogramming, to actually use ESF money for migration. Here is really a recognition, a legal clarification that this can be done and can be more preeminently portrayed in the operational programs. And we also added, to that regard, indicators on this category to really see what member states actually do in terms of addressing the challenge of migrants. For capacity building, just a clarification, we are not just putting aside technical assistance, this is part of it, but also capacity building for social partners and civil society organizations. So this is basically Article 8 of the ESF Plus regulation, and this obviously with in mind exactly the idea that not everybody has the resources and obviously the upfront capacity to be at the table, but support is needed and that will be forthcoming. We also discussed about these numbers, what 100 billion means, what the different strands means, the direct management strands have been reduced. I mean, if we talk about numbers, I don't know if Eric started with that at the moment. I mean, we cannot deny that the budget per se had to be, and I'm talking about the overall budget, had to be a reasonable budget, which still creates an increase. So it's now 1.114 of the GDP. Obviously, the Parliament's position is to go to 1.3% of the EU GDP, because 1.3% effectively would mean no reduction, and to some extent even a proportional increase in many programs. This is a budget which had to strike a balance with a new situation. Obviously, Brexit is one of the contextual situations, but also with new priorities emerging to which we need to provide an answer. I say for the ESF Plus, you also need to consider one thing that we don't do in the future, and obviously certain member states are upset that we don't do that in the future, which is the former thematic objective 11, which is basically support to public administration reforms in areas which are not strictly related to employment and social, or for instance in the case of ERDF, regional development. So I'm talking about reforms that are related to justice or public procurement and so on and so forth. This was an area of 4.7 billion euro, which obviously in this prioritization we cut. And this almost corresponds to the sort of cut in real terms of the ESF Plus. So that is to say we preserved as much as possible, and to some extent in a very good way, the amount of money which is addressing employment and social. Now, these areas do not disappear because there are other funds and other programs, so like for instance the support, the reform support program with the reform delivery tool, which are obviously there to support those areas. And if you talk about, yes, what about the reforms in our areas, this is part, obviously, of the specific objectives implementation where member states can program not only to address people's challenges, but also systems challenges and actually reforms in these specific areas. And with that view, I think I would also reply to the theme of health. So we are not really taking out, quite the contrary. We are creating really a synergy between the, for instance, support to policy development for health reforms through direct management, but then the uptake of it through shared management, which was already the case in ESF, and obviously now we see the potential to really close any gaps in that regard by putting together the two programs. And obviously, the other bet we are also making is that by putting together these programs, we also expect some forms of synergy, so some gains at the margins. So let's hope at least for those which obviously help in terms of their operationalization. I think for the participation of local and regional authorities, I mean, this is regulated by the Common Provision Regulation. Obviously, this is the way the programming is done. If a program is regional, for me, this is the natural consequence that regional and local authorities have to be part of those programs. And I think my previous answer related to health also replies to housing Europe. Now, obviously, in the ESF Plus, we exclude, and this is in the eligibility criteria, any investments in infrastructure. So this we cannot do. But obviously, we can test new ways, operational ways, with the ESI strand. This is the policy innovation component. And obviously, mainstream those testing phases through the share management, as we currently do now. But there, it's obviously we can only deal with the immaterial part of the social housing problem by definition for the ESF Plus.
Thank you very much, Loris. And I suggest that we continue with our agenda. And if you have any specific questions addressed to Loris, I suggest that you kindly submit it to us by email and we will coordinate the replies. And it is my pleasure to welcome with us Director Veronika Weitz from DG Mare, who will present the new regulation for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. So I give the floor to her. Please.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's the first time I meet the structured dialogue and the experts on the European structural funds. My name is Veronika Weitz, as was said by the chair. My directorate is dealing in the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries with the Common Fisheries Policy, with its coordination and development, and its implementation in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So today I have the pleasure to talk to you about our new funding instrument that is part of the ESI family. And if you look at the logo that we have been provided for the presentations on our fund, you will see that we have slipped in some new features, namely a fish and a vessel, so that we have a little bit of maritime touch in our presentation. So the EMFF, it's a small fund, but it's a beautiful fund. For the budget 2021-2027, we have now foreseen in the multi-annual financial framework an amount of 6.14 billion in current prices. That's a reduction of 5% to the current envelope in current prices, because we need to compare apples with apples and not apples with peers. We will continue under the EMFF with two delivery modes. So we will have shared management and we will have direct management. And you see the distribution of funds between the two delivery modes. So 86.5% for shared management and 13.5% for direct management. That's a slight increase, which is justified by the fact that the scope of direct management is being extended. When it comes to the share between the different member states, what the regulation proposes is to continue the allocation key we had in the past, in the current EMFF period, to facilitate also discussions, and also in view of the fact that the last discussions have been quite complicated by using different criteria for that allocation. Now, what does our fund aim at? Basically, our objectives are part of the common policy objectives that are being defined in the Common Provisions Regulation. You have already heard today that the number of policy objectives have been reduced from 11 to 5. The objectives in blue are those who are most relevant for the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. And these common policy objectives, a greener, lower carbon Europe and a Europe closer to citizens, is converted in the EMFF into 4 EMFF priorities, which is also considerable simplifications, because we used to have in the past 6 union priorities, now we move to 4. This will considerably simplify the intervention logic for the programming process in the future. So more specifically, what do we want to achieve with our fund? So the new EMFF, which is our funding tool, will support the objectives of the common fisheries policy. It will support the objectives of the maritime policy and the blue economy, and it will also support the objectives of the Union's international commitments in the area of ocean governance. Let's have a look at priority 1. So, support to the objectives of the CFP remains a core priority. Such support should ensure that fishing activities are environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable in the long term, while they continue to contribute to available food supplies. Support from the European Union budget is necessary to help achieve and maintain sustainable fishing based on maximum sustainable yield, and to reduce the impact of fisheries on the marine environment. This includes support for innovation, investments in low impact and climate resilient and low carbon fishing practices and techniques. And last and not least, under this priority, we will continue to support 2 important strands of our common fisheries policies, which means control and scientific knowledge. These are the cornerstones of fisheries managers. Without control, without data, the policy would not work. So the amounts for these areas of support will be ring-fenced in the national allocations, and support will be available in particular for fishermen that will have to adjust to the new revised control system that we have been tabling by the end of May for discussions by the co-legislators. You see also on the screen that, similar to the other ESI funds, we as EMFF will also contribute to climate mainstreaming. Our target has been set at 30%, and we hope that we will be able to meet the target at the end of the programming period. And finally, what we also have very prominently in this new tool is a stronger consistency with EU environmental legislations, in particular Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Natura 2000 directives, and so on. When it comes to priority 2, we want to ensure food security and nutrition. That's really of importance to us, in particular keeping in mind that 60% of seafood, of fishery products are imported to the European Union. So the challenge here is to encourage the consumption of fish protein produced in the Union, which meets high quality standards and is available for consumers at affordable prices. Therefore, what we foresee under this priority is support to aquaculture, including freshwater aquaculture, processing and marketing of fish and aquaculture products, and that includes also support to producer organizations for the marketing and production plans they are supposed to put in place. When it comes to priority 3, we will the vision is to develop a sustainable blue economy within the European Union. And here we are looking into two strands of action. One is that the EMFF should concentrate on enabling conditions for the development of sustainable blue economy, which means removing bottlenecks to facilitate investments and the development of new markets and technologies. And the second strand we have under priority 3 is that we want to encourage bottom-up-led approaches for local development strategy. That's the community-led local development programs that we have already under the current EMFF. But certainly what we want to do is to strengthen those activities under the Future Fund. And last but not least, priority 4 envisages to strengthen international ocean governance and enabling safe, secure, clean and sustainable managed seas and oceans. So far for the priorities. Let's have a look on what's new. First of all, we want to make sure that what we fund is closely linked to the conservation objectives of the common fisheries policy. In the past, in particular in the EFFF, in the European Fisheries Fund, we had cases where our support was in contradiction to the policy objectives. So we have more closely linked fleet-related support measures to the conservation objectives of the common fisheries policy. A second area which is new and strengthened is preferential support to small-scale fisheries in outermost regions. Small-scale fisheries, so fisheries below 12 meters without towed gears, are making up 75% of European fisheries. So it's really important to support them since they're really important for the viability of coastal areas. To do this, what we foresee is that member states have to put in place action plans for small-scale fisheries. We foresee a high aid intensity for small-scale fisheries of up to 100%, and they have access to support measures that are not eligible for other parts of the industry. With regard to outermost regions, is that we want to have a more integrated approach to the outermost regions. They have a particular situation and deficiencies and challenges due to their remoteness. Therefore, it's important to tap on the potential for blue economy in those regions. And what we want to do is to have an integrated plan in each member state for each of the regions concerned. And we have also dedicated a separate envelope to those regions so that they really have the hand on the support level for the regions. In the area of aquaculture, everything is possible, which is a nice tool, and preferably member states provide these possibilities in the form of grants. However, in the area of productive investments in aquaculture, we foresee that these productive investments should be provided through financial instruments. I have been talking about enabling conditions for the development of sustainable blue economy. This is an area which we definitely are strengthening under the current fund, under the new fund. In the past fund, the possibilities for funding blue economy were pretty limited. So this is a strong new focus which we try to see implemented by the member states. Then the two new novelties I have also already touched upon, those maritime security and surveillance and contribution to the implementation of international commitments in order to have our seas clean, healthy, and safe. Finally, and that was an important call by all the stakeholders when we entered into consultation with them, was the call for simplification and flexibility. You know, we are part of the CPR family of the Common Rule Book, so I don't have to repeat all the simplifications that are coming from the Common Rule Book. I'm sure my colleagues of DG Regio have been explaining them. But we have also tried to replicate the simplification within our own fund. So what you see is in the period in 2014 and 2020, what we had was a very rigid straitjacket of very prescriptive measures, which caused lots of interpretation questions and didn't allow much flexibility to member states to program according to the specific circumstances. What we foresee now in the EMFF for the next programming period is lots of flexibility for member states in order to optimize the achievements of objectives. So how is this being done? We do not define measures anymore. Basically, what we define are areas of support And we give a list of no-goes areas, so list of measures which are not eligible. For instance, we do not want that any measure, any support is granted to increase fishing capacity or the ability to catch fish. And for some sensitive measures, we make sure that they are conditioned in a way that they are not contravening the objectives of the policy. With that, member states will have all the flexibility to program the EMFF in the future according to their needs. In addition, what we also want to do in order to enhance the achievement of objective is to strengthen the performance orientations, which basically means member states will have to define milestones and targets, and we will be in a regular communication with the member states on the basis of annual reporting, annual review meetings, in order to redirect what they're doing under the operational programs. So all in all, we think that the MFF, as it has been tabled by the Commission, is an evolution and not a revolution, and it should provide a certain degree of stability to the member states and to the sector, whilst allowing for more flexibility and simplification in the future. What's next? You know that we have started our discussions with the co-legislators, so we have started presentations of the proposal to the member states in the Council. We have started the presentations in the European Parliament, and we will try to work as quickly as possible with them to get the legislation adopted as quickly as possible, because I think our common agenda is that we should avoid any delays in the approval of operational programs to avoid a situation we are having had in the current programming period. With that, I will stop, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, questions? Can Europe, please?
Thank you. Markus Kliman, 800.
Are there any other immediate questions from colleagues, or then we looking at the flags? I don't see any immediate other question. Perhaps we directly address. Thank you.
If there's no other question, it's an ambitious target. We know that all, but what we have foreseen in the regulation is a tracking system, a marking system, which gives indications on to which extent we think a certain support will contribute to achieving the objectives of climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Of course, it's always hypothetical, right? That's nothing to be hidden, but it's also a possibility to monitor in the implementation of the program where member states stand in achieving that target. And as I said before, we have this performance evaluation process on a steady basis, which allows us also to redirect member states if we think it's not going into the right direction. Yeah? So it's as for all other objectives, achieving of milestones, it will be a process of cooperation between us and the member states in order to make sure that we achieve our targets. We have similar tracking also for environmental objectives. So we have already done that in the past, and we will continue to do that in the future.
Thank you. Other questions? If no, that thank you very much for your presentation. And I suggest that we continue with our agenda. It is my pleasure to welcome Mihail Dumitru, the Deputy Director General in DG Agri, who will present to us the proposals for the common agricultural policy.
Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a brief presentation of the legislative proposal for the new common agriculture policy. As you may know, this has been adopted on the 1st of June, and it's made up of 3 basic acts. One is about the CAP strategic plan. The second one is about the horizontal regulation concerning the 2 funds for the common agriculture policy, European Agriculture Fund for rural development and European Agriculture Guarantee Fund. And there is a third regulation which concerns amendments, adjustment to the common market organizations. I am trying to give you the most important element of this package. Of course, it will be very difficult to present in 15 minutes the content of such a package. Okay. Yeah. When we have started to develop this proposal, we started with a very strong mandate for simplification and modernization of the future common agriculture policy. Actually, I would have liked to change the order of my points here in the slide. We had a lot of discussions with the stakeholders. We have a lot of discussion in the council, different structures, and we have a lot of discussion inside the European Parliament about a real need for simplifying the common agriculture policy and modernizing the policy. So this come very strongly in the very wide consultation we organized last year, and you know that we got quite a lot of replies to this consultation, and the issue of simplification and modernization came very strongly. So in order to do this, we started also from a lot of reflections inside the Commission we have done with the other funds. You remember there was this high-level group on simplification, chaired by the former Vice President Salas, where we've been part of this, and we have taken into account many of the suggestions made by our member states and by our stakeholders, our beneficiaries. And we have started by thinking how to rebalance the responsibility between Brussels and the member states, and to give more subsidiarity to the member states, because in the current policy and in the past, we had a very prescriptive policy. I mean, to give you an example, in the CAP regulations, in the current period, we have elements which goes up to the level of micromanagement of the farms. We establish ourselves rules for crop diversification, and we establish for each kind of farm how many crops they should have on the farm and on what area and how to manage the farm. So everybody told us this is too much. We need to get out of this, and you need to go into a situation where the member states at different levels, national, regional, or even local level, they know much better than you how we should manage this process. And therefore, this was our main objective for this regulation. Then, of course, we were confronted with 3 main aspects we have taken into account. First of all, we needed to have a more targeted and result and performance-based support. And this was one of the objectives we followed through this process. Then it comes again and again the issue of fairer distribution of the main part of the agriculture policy, which is the direct payments. When you know the very famous 80-20 split, which means that 80% of the money goes to 20% of the farmers, and we wanted to try again to have a better distribution and to help more those in need, which are the small and medium-sized farms, because the large farms, they always enjoy the economy of scale and they will not need so much support for at least income support. But of course, we also listen to very strong societal demands regarding the climate and environmental ambition, and maybe I will also come to the question you asked to my colleague previously. And this was one of the main elements we look at in this proposal. So when we shape our new proposal, we wanted to reverse, if you want, things which were very challenging in this period, and to rethink the CAP governance. So we wanted to move from a system where we were controlling and penalizing to move to a system where we are looking to achieving performance, getting results. We wanted to take into account specificities of the farming in different parts of the EU. And you may agree with me that the farming is so different from the south to the north or east to west. And in many, many cases, we have a lot of difficulties of finding, in the current policy, which is very prescriptive, addressing specificity of these farms in different parts of Europe. And we wanted to give this possibility to the member states. And they will be much better placed to design exactly how they need to tackle different farming systems, different kind of sectors, different kind of productions in agriculture sector and in the rural economy. We wanted to reduce a lot of overlaps and diminish the complexity. And this led us to put forward a proposal which is rebalancing the responsibility between the EU and the member states. And what is probably a novelty for the CAP compared with the other policies is that we opted for a new delivery model, which is based on performance, which at the EU level we only look to achieving the performance and measuring this performance and working with the member states to deliver. And the member states will continue to look into all the aspects related to legality, regularity, and we will base our assessment and our management on the national authorities, and especially on the certifying body, which is going to look into these aspects. But of course, we are not going to leave this completely in the hands of the member states. We are going to check and be sure that the member states, they have system in place that gives us all these guarantees. Therefore, in this new rebalancing, we are going to fix at the EU level the specific objective of the policies, and I'm going to give you details about these specific objectives and how they are going to be handled in the process of the management of the policy. We're going to fix a common set of indicators, and different type of indicator, they will have different purposes in the policy. And then we are going to define broad type of interventions. Another novelty which I have not mentioned to you is that we, for the first time, are going to have a CAP plan for the whole CAP, first pillar, second pillar, market measures included. Of course, with the exception for the market measures, we do not include in the programming process the management of the markets, the system of intervention of the market, because they don't make sense to make to add them into a plan, into a programming process. But then the member state, they will have a lot of subsidiarity and freedom to identify their needs and to put this in the CAP plan, to tailor the CAP intervention to their needs, but also to tailor this intervention in such a way that convince us that they are going to achieve the results that we are going to agree together. And they are going to be in charge of implementation and to monitor the progress towards targets, and we are going regularly to sit together with them and to see to what extent they are moving towards these targets. And if there is need, we need to agree together on actions to bring the member states that are not following the right path to bring them back to meet this. I think the very important is we started with defining specific objective for the common agriculture policy. As you know, we have in the treaty, in Article 39, the general objective for the CAP, and in each period we translate these objectives to the new context, to the new period. So in this period, we have taken into account the Commission political priorities, and then we take into account a very strong international commitment the European Union has made. They are related to the Sustainable Development Goals, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, we have translated the general objective into the broader CAP objective, which is to foster resilient farm sector, and this is the economic one, to bolster the environment and climate, and then to strengthen the fabric in rural areas. So we maintain the three main broad objectives, which is economic, environment and climate, and social. But then we translate these broad objectives into 9 specific objectives. And these 9 specific objectives, they have to be translated by the member states in the CAP plan in a very tangible way. So they have to address all these objectives somehow. And you know, from the economic point of view, they translate into 3 specific objectives, which is ensure fair income for farmers, increase competitiveness and rebalance the power in the food chain, in the food value chain. And you know that we had a lot of complaints of our farmers that their position in the value chain is not the most appropriate. Therefore, the Commission has decided, not only the Commission, I think the Parliament and the Council also support the idea of rebalancing this power over the food chain. Then we concentrate a lot on the environment and climate. So we'll have 3 specific objectives. We have climate change actions, environmental care, and protecting the landscape and biodiversity. And then for social, we have also taken into account a very general concern at the European Union, which is the generational renewal. We do not manage in Europe to ensure a natural, normal renewal of generations, and therefore there is a very big question mark about the future of farming in Europe. So we have a set of instruments in this period, but we want to strengthen even more these instruments. Then we want to maintain a vibrant rural areas, and then we took into account a lot of societal preoccupation about food and health. Apart these 9 general objectives, specific objectives, we have a cross-cutting CAP objective, which is related to sustainability, modernization, and simplification. We want to foster the innovation and knowledge transfer. We want to foster smart farming, smart villages, and the use of new technologies and modern technologies, and this is going to guarantee also the modernization of the sector, but the modernization of the policy as well. I told you that we were looking to many societal demands. They were not only translated through specific objective, as I mentioned to you, especially the specific objective under the climate, environment, and social. But we have added in the policy a lot of other elements. So for the health and safety and nutritional and sustainable food and food waste and animal welfare, we have added a specific objective. But then we have added other elements in the policy. For instance, we have added specific indicators which are referring to these societal demands. For instance, share of agriculture land concerned by supported specific actions would lead to sustainable use of pesticides and other in order to reduce the risk and impact of pesticides. I think this was a very strong societal demand. We have added in some part of the market support the possibility of increasing consumptions to support more healthy nutrition and healthy style of life. We have also added in the what we call enhanced conditionalities elements, which are addressing food safety, animal and plant health. We have also provided the obligation of the member states to assist the farmers and the beneficiary by farm advisory services, and the farm advisory services, they are integrated in the broader agriculture knowledge and innovation systems. And of course, there are other elements. We have payments for hire, commitments available for reducing fertilizer, and for addressing a lot of environment and climate aspects. And of course, we continue the EU school fruits and vegetable and milk schemes. So I told you that one of the main aspects of the new CAP is focus on performance. And how we organize this? I mean, we start from the common objectives. We fix a set of common indicators and general type of interventions. These are going to be fixed at the EU level. We have to strike a very right balance between the elements we fix at the EU level and the element of subsidiarity. I mean, we have seen now, after the package has been adopted, a lot of questions regarding how we maintain the common aspect of the policy, and to be sure also that we give enough subsidiarity and simplification in hands of the member states. But we consider that we keep the necessary elements at the EU level that will guarantee the commonality of the policy, also giving a lot of elements to the member states. So in terms of, I would say, the assurance, the financial assurance, we will continue actually to have an annual financial clearance, and this is linked to the legality and regularity. We are going to keep the same structure we have in place, the paying agencies, the certifying bodies, the integrated administrative and control system, the land parcel identification system, which are elements that demonstrated that we can have a sound management of the EU funds for the CAP in shared management. And we are going to maintain all these elements, and we are going also to continue to audit and approve the systems putting in place. I mean, we have a different system from the other ESI funds. As you know, we don't have we have these elements which are continued, and they are accredited paying agencies that will continue to exist. For this reason, we will have common output indicators, will be very important in the process. And the main issue you have to keep in mind is that this assurance system, which is based on a new delivery model on an annual performance clearance, is going to avoid that we reimburse to the member state expenditure without outputs. So we will have a control of a system that if we pay an expenditure to the member state, we reimburse the member state, we have to be sure that there is an output behind. But then we are going to have a strong system of monitoring the performance, and this is based on an annual performance review, like in this period, and we are going to have an annual performance report, and we are going to check annually the progress towards the targets. We are going to fix targets after the 7 years, and during the period we are going to have milestones, and every year we are going to check to what extent the milestones they are fulfilled. Therefore, we are sure that the member states they can achieve the results indicator they agreed in the plan. In case there is something which is not going into the right direction, we are going to take actions if there is lack of progress, and if the actions taken are not effective or are not taken, we may go for suspending the payments until these actions are correcting the situation and we will come to a normal situation. But I have to say that this will be quite exceptional, because we also always believe, and based on the experience we have now, actions taken usually lead to improving and getting back to a progress we want to achieve. And then policy performance will also be measured by interim evaluation. We will assess the performance toward the objectives, and at the end of the period we are going to assess to what extent we have reached the necessary impact, so we have common impact indicators. So in a nutshell, this is how we conceive this new delivery model, where our policy will be programmed based on performance and implemented based on performance. Of course, there is a lot of questions about how we are going to ensure the higher climate and environmental ambition. And we had a CAP architecture in this period, which is based on 3 different layers. We have what we call the cross-compliance, which is a set of common obligation for all the farmers receiving CAP money. And we have the greening, which is based on a kind of a ring fencing, 30% of the direct payments. And the farmers and the member states, they have to comply with a number of eligibility elements to get this money. And then there is also a system of penalty behind. And we have the third element, which is the voluntary commitments taken by the beneficiaries under the rural development. And this system proved to be very complicated and not very effective. And therefore, following the criticism, different assessments, we come to the conclusion that we should simplify this architecture and make it more streamlined and easier to implement. And this is what we call now the new enhanced conditionalities, which means that all the payments you have listed here below, the direct payments and the rural development, taken by a farmer, they will be subject of fulfilling these enhanced conditionalities. These enhanced conditionalities, they are based on the current system of cross-compliance in terms of content and in terms of, let's say, sanction and penalties, but they integrate some streamlines element from the greening, for instance, the crop rotation instead of crop diversification, and some other elements we have added in these enhanced conditionalities, and we have added additional elements because these are enhanced conditionalities. They can be broadly grouped into 3 blocks, as you see here, environment and climate. And you know, there are elements, new elements we have added in, like the Water Framework Directive or the Directive on the Sustainable Use of Pesticide under the Public Animal Health and Plant Health. And of course, the farmers and the beneficiary, they will be, as I mentioned to you, assisted by farm advisory services. The member state, they have the obligation to put in place and support the farmers in complying with these conditionalities. Then in the Common Agricultural Policy Strategic Plan, I told you that we put together the first pillar, second pillar, and the operational programs under the Common Market Organization, under one strategic plan where the member states, they do one ex-ante assessment and they establish the need, and we hope in this way we'll have a stronger coordination and interlink between the element of the policy, which was not the case in the past. So these slides give you a general overview of the new direct payment system, which is based on a basic income support for sustainability, and we call it for sustainability because it is subject of these enhanced conditionalities. Basically, this is a system of payments per eligible hectares. When I say this, you know that in the current period we have several member states applying a single area payment system, especially the Central and Eastern European countries, and a system of rights, of entitlements, which is applied in all the member states. And they have the freedom now to opt for one or the other. If they continue to do the payment entitlement system, then there is also an obligation to continue the internal convergence and to reach at least 70% of the average in 2026 at the latest. And of course, every member state continuing with this will have to have a minimum value per payment entitlement. The member states will have, as I told you, possibilities to differentiate by group of territories, the territories facing the same socioeconomic and agronomic conditions. And they can also establish the minimum requirements, like the minimum size above which they pay this payment. So this will continue to be the main element for income support to farmers, but this will be conditional of fulfilling of all these enhanced conditionalities. In addition to this, the member states, they can complement the direct income support for sustainability with complementary redistributive payments. And this will come also as an additional top-up per hectare. They will be oriented towards the small and medium-sized farms. And then the members say they have also freedom to to decide the ranges of the hectares, the number of hectares to be eligible for. And you know that I told you about the fairer distribution of the direct support. And the Commission is proposing to, above a certain level, and this level is fixed as a 60,000 euro per beneficiary, to apply a progressive reduction of the payment and to cap it completely at 100,000 euro. So the products of this capping will be used for this complementary redistributive possibilities for the direct basic income support, but also for other elements like a complementary income support for young farmers. In addition, this higher ambition for environment and climate will be also possible through planning eco schemes, and this is an additional layer for the farmers that want to engage in more, let's say, beneficial actions for climate and environment. And this will be above the baseline fixed by the enhanced conditionalities. In principle, we'll maintain the general objective of having the direct support decoupled, but of course, like in this period, we will keep a possibility for the member states on a voluntary basis to apply coupled support, and we fix this within some limits, so we should not exceed 10% of the overall envelope. Of course, we will allow 2% more for encouraging protein crops. We keep almost the same sectors, and we have added some additional sectors, especially for non-food products with potential to replace fossil materials in the bioeconomy. Instead of this architecture of the direct support, the members say they have the freedom to choose and to pay around sum to the small farmers. This will be voluntary for the farmers, but the members say they can decide to do this, so the farmers, they can apply either to stay in the complex one or to go for the small one, for the small farmers, of course. But then there will be a possibility for the member states to decide to move money between the first pillar and second pillar. There will be, I will come later on this, but the question is what's happened if the product of the capping who cannot cover all these elements, so they can have the possibility to transfer this money to the second pillar and do more, let's say, actions and type of interventions that fits better there, and this will not be co-financed. It will be 100% financed by the EU budget. Of course, there are other elements which keep the commonality of the policy. That we have a number of definitions, and these definitions will only provide a framework at the EU level, but each member state will have to define this definition to fit their particular situation. I mean, the one example which I can give you is on genuine farmers. We always try to deliver this support to the real farmers, to the ones that are really doing the farming and contributing to the public goods. But we never managed to do this in a prescriptive way in the legislation. In this period, we have a definition of active farmer, and this definition didn't prove to be very effective. Therefore, we have now decided to give to the member states to prepare a definition for their specific situation, which define what means genuine farmer in context, I don't know, of Latvia or Cyprus or France or other member states. For the rural development policy, first of all, I think you know that we are no longer under the partnership agreement with the other ESI funds, and this was done because of the stronger consistency of the CAP, and also the risk of, let's say, discussion and the adoption in the co-decision by different structure of the Parliament and by the Council. and we wanted to be sure that the new delivery model is not impacted by changes that will be done in different part of the co-decision that will not make will make this delivery model, new delivery model, let's say, completely out of the scope. So there was a last moment decision, and we are no longer under the partnership agreement. The major simplification, and I saw this was also presented by a colleague from DG Mare, is that we are giving up the very prescriptive measures. We are going to have 8 general type of interventions, and the member state, they have a total freedom of designing the specificity of this type of intervention and selecting the most appropriate mix of intervention that fits their situation. What is new is also the member state will have the obligation to plan the program in the plan risk management tools, which is a novelty. In the past, it was only on a voluntary basis. We have opened the possibility to enhance synergies with LIFE projects and Erasmus type exchanges for young farmers. We maintain the ring fencing for the climate and environment expenditure, so at 30%, and we have excluded from this 30% the area with natural constraints. However, the area with natural constraints will continue to be weighted against the ambition for climate tracking, which is for the CAP fixed at 40%. We paid a lot of attention to the generational renewal, and we have increased the maximum amount we would like to give for installation of young farmers. We have increased it to 100,000 euro per young farmer. We're going to maintain a strong coordination. Also, we are no longer part of the partnership agreement with the ESI Fund, and this is going to be done through mentioning in the CAP plan the complementarity and demarcation with this fund, and we want to see exactly how the EFRD will continue to contribute together with the other funds for supporting rural areas, rural economy. I mentioned that we have also introduced the operational programs under the Common Market Organization into the CAP plan. Maybe you don't know too much about this. You know, we have under the first pillar a number of operational programs, and these are for fruit and vegetables, for wine, for olive and table olive, for apiculture, or for hops. And now there is a possibility that the member states, based on the need assessment, they develop other operational programs and they add them within a limits of maximum 3% of the first pillar. They can program this program in the CAP plan. I'm not going to develop more on this. I mean, there will be some changes, as I mentioned to you, for fruit and vegetables, and we are want to encourage using these funds to promote innovation and to address climate and environment. There is also an increased allocation. We want to double the support for apiculture, especially for protecting and developing the pollinators. And of course, I mentioned to you that we are going to keep this additional possibility within a limit, which is 3% of the direct payments. As you know, that following the MFF decision, the CAP budget for the next period has been reduced. So this reduction was 5% for the overall budget. So now the CAP will have a little bit less than 1/3 of the EU budget to fulfill the objectives fixed for this policy. The reduction was smaller for the first pillar, but this reduction applied to different components of the first pillar, which is direct payments, including POSEI, market measures, and they were going to have less assigned revenue. I don't want to enter in these technicalities. I can explain to you. And then for the second pillar, we have a bigger reduction, but this reduction is supposed to be compensated by additional national contribution by the member states by increasing the co-financing rate by the member states. The member state will have a lot of flexibility to move money between pillars, as I mentioned already, so they can move money in both directions to the amount of 15% of the funds, and they can add, in addition to the 15% from the first pillar to the second pillar, an additional 15% for climate and environment actions. And maybe this will also answer the question asked before, how we are going to mainstream the climate actions. I mean, we are not only following a target. We have a lot of instruments put into the policy to contribute to mainstreaming climate and environment actions in the common agriculture policy. And this is also a possibility offered by the member states to those who want to have a much higher ambition. They are free to move more money from the first pillar to the second pillar and dedicate this money for climate and environment actions. And of course, there is an additional possibility for young farmers. So the member state, they have to use at least 2% of the direct payment envelope, equivalent of the direct payments envelope, for supporting generational renewal. They can do it in the first pillar, in the second pillar, or in both of them. But if they can also move money from the first to the second pillar. And I mentioned to you that the money transfer from the first to the second pillar will not be subject to national co-financing. I mentioned that we are going to have one single strategic plan, and this is a bit the content foreseen by the regulation, what should be in this plan. And this plan will be adopted by the Commission, and we are going to verify that all these elements are addressed accordingly by the member states before we are approving the plan. I'm not going to go through them. I mean, they basically mirror to some extent the main elements we have now in any of the operational programs. We'll start, of course, with a need assessment, with an ex ante and a SWOT analysis, and then they have to develop an intervention strategies. They have to fix then the targets, a type of operations, and allocate the money. And then they also need to indicate the governance and coordination systems, and then the other elements for modernization. And we need to monitor together these elements with the member states. The preparation of the plan will follow the partnership principles. So the member state, they will have to consult widely all the actors involved for the preparation of the plan, meaning the stakeholders, the public authorities, the economic, environment, social partners. And there is also a request that the competent authority for environment and climate, they are strongly associated to this process, because in the past we have situations where there were complaints that, for instance, the rural development program, they were not necessarily coordinated between different authorities, including the environment and climate. So we have now a very clear request from this point of view in the new regulation. Well, we'll have a process of approval. The member state, they have to submit a CAP plan by the latest 1st of January 2020. And then the Commission is going to approve the plans based on the completeness, consistency, coherence, and general principle of the Union law. We have a deadline, and we fix an 8 months deadline for approval. Of course, with a stop the clock, I mean, we will have the possibility to ask the member states additional information, explanation request. And with the moment we ask this, we'll stop the clock. And when they will come in, they will start the clock again. Member states will have the possibility to review the plan once a year, we propose. And then we fix a deadline for the amendment of the plan. And of course, the member state, they will also have the possibility to review the change of money between the pillar in 2023. I told you that we are no longer covered by the Common Provision Regulation, but we keep a very strong link with the Common Provision Regulation. We have opted out from the Common Provision Regulation. We are still applying 4 elements of the Common Provision Regulation, and we have opted in for many of the Common Provision Regulation in our regulation. And I mentioned to you that the reason for this was because we do not have under control the co-legislation process in other structures of the Parliament and of the Council, and there was a high risk that because of lack of control of how this will evolve, we are going to have the new delivery model put in danger, and therefore it was a last-minute decision to opt out. So we have 4 elements where we keep, we apply the rules. One is the CLLD leader, where we keep the approach of multi-fund, and the basic rules are fixed in the common provision regulation. And of course, we have established clear definition of roles of the intervention of different funds. So the EFRD will not support setting up of non-agricultural activities in a rural area other than the one related to the farming and farm diversification. And we are not going to support large infrastructure in a rural area. This was always the case in the past, but we had some exception in the past on the renewable energy and the broadband. And we'll keep a strong coordination demarcation, and this is going to be presented in the CAP plan. So basically, I told you I have 4 areas where we keep using the common provision regulation. This is the CLLD, is the sound economic governance, and the rules for visibility and publicity. And of course, to a certain extent, the financial instruments. But we have also specific elements developed in the CAP regulation for financial instruments. I told you that we have taken from the CPR a lot of elements. We have added them in our regulation. This refers to the definition, to the selection of operation, to all the system related to simplified cost options, eligibility of expenditure. They also come from the strong relationship with the financial regulation. Multi-level governance, approval and amendments of the program. Basically, they follow the same process, but they are spelled out in different regulation in the same way. Function of the managing authority, we're going to keep the role of the monitoring committee. We're going to provide technical assistance for the whole plan, not only for the rural development, and rules for transparency and communication. Well, this is in a nutshell a very brief presentation, so there are many things to be said about this proposal, but I am now listening to you and ready to ask the question, to answer the question. Sorry.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. I see Kopa, please. Kopa.
Yes, thank you. Marko Mäki-Hekola, representing Kopa. I could talk a lot about this, but to be short, a few things. First, we are a little bit worried about the coming budget, and because it's limited to 1.1 about, and therefore we urge the decision makers that the budget ceiling should be at least at 1.2, and with that budget we could achieve those goals what we have on rural development or agriculture or cohesion policy, and why this is so important. It's because we need a secure rural development. We need to have viable rural development, food production, and forestry, and at all European countries. And with 1.1, it's not possible. The simplification, it's good goal. It's good goal for cohesion policy and especially for CAP. But we are a little bit worried about the new measures such as conditionality, capping, and the distributive payments, eco schemes, and so on. That could lead to more complex CAP, and it would also increase the workload for farmers for receiving less money than today. And at the same time, we should have some kind of wise implementation, including reasonable and fair system of sanctions. So there are a lot of questions how simple that this future cap could be. And also this capping, it's not clear yet. Will it harm the continuation of positive structural development of farmers? How it would influence the competitive possibilities of farms? So there is lot to do. Could I have few comments about the cohesion policy, because it was short discussion at this morning. In the future, rural areas and sparsely populated areas, they are going to be the base for bio. and circular economy, and also the development of whole European economy and tackling climate change and so on. And I'm not sure how these areas, I mean rural areas and sparsely populated areas, are included on those cohesion policy proposals. Will there be some guarantees that there is good balance between developing rural areas and urban areas under cohesion policy, and the infrastructure investments also, those are hugely needed on rural areas, and I hope there is some possibilities to have structural funds and also connecting Europe facility on investments. We need to have good cooperation between InvestEU structural funds and CAP. And on some way, SMEs should be more visible on the policy objectives. They are behind all those 5 main objectives, but perhaps it could be good for Europe to have SMEs also visible on those policy objectives. I think I stop now because the time is almost up.
Well, on the budget, we would have hoped to have 1.8 either. Unfortunately, this budget has been decided based on 1.1, and the objective was to minimize the cut for the CAP, and especially to protect, let's say, the part of the policy which was, which has a very big impact of the life of the farmers, which is the direct support. So we managed to get a 5% cut for the CAP, 3.9% reduction for the first pillar, and a much bigger for the second pillar, unfortunately. But of course, we have introduced this possibility of flexibility between pillars to be decided by the member states. I know that some of the member states, they cannot play too much about this to compensate what they lose under the second pillar. And of course, this has been done in a difficult budgetary context. If in the MFF negotiation there will be another outcome, we will be very happy to have more money for the CAP, of course. And I think the other policy will have the same view, but it's nothing we can do. I mean, from our point of view at this moment, it is left to the decision on the MFF. On the simplification, we are happy that you appreciate that the proposal can achieve this or can go in this direction. I mean, I think we also need to do a lot of explanation and probably clarification regarding the system of conditionalities, sanction. We consider that our proposal brings a lot of simplification. First of all, the enhanced conditionalities is based on the cross-compliance system, which was, if we compare with the other elements of the CAP, was much simpler and much more into the hands of the member states. And we have applied this approach now to the enhanced conditionality, which include other elements, and in principle it should be much simpler than the existing system. Of course, it depends very much how member states will define these eco-conditionalities, because we set up a framework for the enhanced conditionality. We set up a framework, and this has to be translated by each member states in national standards, and they have to put these national standards into the plan. So we hope that the member states will define the most appropriate standards which fits with their situation. And of course, from the point of view of the sanction and the penalty system, it follows the cross-compliance, which is much simpler, and it is much more left into the hands of the member states to decide the level of the sanctions and how to apply it. And therefore, we consider that there is simplification, and also in the general approach of more subsidiarity. So the external convergence, you know, there was an issue which was also adopted in the MFF. The Commission has proposed that this will continue, and in the next period, the member states that are below the EU average in terms of direct payments, they are going to have half of this gap between the current level and 90% of the EU average cover over the next over a 6 year over the next period. So basically, the gap between direct payments is going to be further reduced and continue the external convergence. Capping and the influence of the structural development of farms. I mean, capping, it's a politically very sensitive issue. It has been always in the past, and we got everywhere a strong request that we should organize the CAP in a much fairer way and to allocate direct support to that farmer that need more. And this is the intention. Of course, you can say, yeah, all this capping and redistributive will create some administrative burden, which is true. But I will not create more administrative burden than we have because redistributive payments there was also possible in this period. Yeah, I mean, we have made some assessment to see to what extent the capping will affect different member states and looking especially to the structure. And you know that this 80-20% distribution also mirror very much the structure of the farms in the member states, and you know this is a very general let's say appreciation at the EU level. The situation is very different from one member state to another. However, we are trying to improve the distribution of direct support and to, let's say, reduce and reallocate to small and medium-sized farms because they need more of the support. We hope that by deducting the labor cost, because we have introduced the possibility for the member state to deduct labor in large, not only salaries, this will reduce and eliminate the effect of on jobs, and therefore let's say the net results of the capping would be lower because the member state they can deduct this labor cost, and then according to our assessment there will be a limited number of member states which will be affected by this capping. But then I think the redistribution, many member states, they already have it and wanted to continue to have it because I think it's a good policy to redistribute money and not to distribute money that they don't need so much. We have very large farm in Europe, and there was always the question why we continue to give income support to these very large farms. I think there was some question regarding the cohesion, which I will not be able to reply.
I suggest now that yes, thank you also for the questions on cohesion. I suggest that we come back to you on writing with more details and detailed elements, and perhaps now we focus on the common agricultural policy. So I see here in the back, I'm sorry, I can't see your UAPN. Yes, Monsieur Delorme, yes. Please.
Oui, merci. Thank you very much. Honestly, I am quite surprised concerning the quality of your presentation. Thank you very much, because I had a lot of questions, and you have practically answered to practically all my questions. We are very, very, very concerned by rural funds. Only two figures. 6 million of small and micro enterprises work in rural areas. And we consider that 4 million of these enterprises work directly for or with farmers and forestry sector. And we see a new phenomenon. Since many years, many high-tech and low-tech enterprises, small enterprises, having no action with farmers works now, more and more of them works now in rural areas. And we are concerned, and even if it can be strange, but we are directly concerned you have 9 specific objectives, and small and micro enterprises, non-farming small and micro enterprises are concerned by 5 of them. I have a lot of questions after reading the CAP strategic plans. I don't want to enter in the details. I will send you some remarks. But one point is interesting. Article 94 on partnership. You speak on, in point 3b, you say that it's very important to develop partnership with the economic and social actors. In practice, we see that in the majority of member states, actors, economic and social actors, which are not farmers, are not involved. And there is a lot to do to guarantee participation of economic and social, all economic and social actors. Our organizations at national and territorial level regret not to be really associated. And there is, in fact, no real partnership in the CAP policy and in rural, in Pillar 2. And what we would like is to work with you on how to better involve all economic and social partners concerned by rural activities. I have also one other point I would like also to underline is situation of monitoring committees. In monitoring committees of concern, sorry, I'm quite tired. In monitoring committees, managing, having in charge CAP policy and rural activities, in fact, we see that small and micro enterprises representatives are generally not involved. It's a reality. Question: how do you think it will be possible to harmonize or to coordinate managing monitoring committees in a CAP sector and monitoring committees of other funds? Sorry, I think that you have understood my question.
I will try to answer. Of course, we are very interested to support the SMEs in rural area. And we have worked with colleagues from DG Regio and the other funds to see exactly who should do what in the rural area. You know that following our core conference, we wanted to follow this rural proofing, and we want to see that all the EU funds, they contribute to development of rural area. However, we have fixed some rules about the scope of intervention of our funds. You know, we will continue to support all the SMEs which are related to farm activity, and even if they are not in agricultural activity, we continue to support them if they are, let's say, developed by farmers, entrepreneurs. We will have a general exemption under the CLLD. So this CLLD will not follow this approach. So basically the LAGs, the local area groups, they can propose in their strategy to support all kind of intervention, not taking care of this demarcation. Yeah, we would like the other funds also to contribute into the rural area, but of course we want also to support the bioeconomy, and this is very important for the future of the rural area. And yeah, it is in our objective to support more the activities related to the bioeconomy, and I think many of them, they are related to the farm activity, because they are developing the raw materials, and then therefore it is in the scope of our policy. How to involve them in the partnership? I mean, we have the general principle of partnership, and we would like the member states to involve the widest possible consultation of all the actors. And we mention in our article that there should be all relevant actors. I mean, it depends very much how the SMEs are also organized in each member state. I mean, of course, we try to introduce, we have in this period is the code of conduct, and we explain to the member states how they should involve all the actors. We are very favorable of supporting the widest participation, but of course we cannot stay behind each member state and tell them who should be in the partnership. We can, of course, raise with the member states where we have the feeling that there is not enough participation from one sector and another, raise the issue and urge them to take into account all the interest for the specific program, and for sure we're going to do this for the CAP plan. We're going to have a bit of a challenging situation in this period, because we have extended the CAP plan to the whole CAP. That means that the stakeholders in the partnership should represent now the whole CAP. And then there is an issue of the size of this partnership. So far we had only the rural development, and also for rural development, I think there are opinions that there was not enough participation or enough representation. And now we are going to have a much, let's say, stronger interest of different actors in the CAP plan, and we have to be sure that different sectors, they are properly represented. How can we help this? I mean, we are going to work with the member states a lot. We are starting from now on to prepare the preparation of the new CAP plan, and we always insist that they invite the relevant actors. But I think it's also very important for you. You have to activate your representative in each member states, and they have to make them known to the agriculture authority and ask them to be taken into account. And we can support you in this action by informing and asking member states to take this into consideration. We will have many discussions with the member states, and we will insist very much that this partnership is a real partnership, and they try to take all the let's say representative actors into account, and they should not forget this very important part of SME in the rural area, because I think they are very important for the rural development in general, and they should be present there. So on the monitoring committees, of course, this is going to mirror somehow. The partnership will be then mirrored in the monitoring committees. And yeah, I think there is now very clear rules about how the monitoring committee, they should be set up, how they should operate, and who should be in. Of course, not with all the, let's say, elements. And I mean, we can, in the same way, work with you and with the member states. I mean, first of all, different organizations represented in the area, they should make them known. I mean, I really don't know. I have to check with my colleagues in charge of different programs. But now it's more difficult because we have 118 programs, so we have 116 monitoring committees. To what extent the SME sector is represented in this? I have no clear picture how much they are or they are not represented. But we can raise this issue with the member states. For the future, we are going to have one monitoring committee per plan, and the member states, they have to to set up these monitoring committees in time. Of course, we are going to guide the member states and give them all the elements, but we cannot force them. I mean, we have no say in this composition of the monitoring committee than to make, recommendation to the member states. And in addition, we are in this philosophy of giving higher subsidiarity and responsibility to the member states. I mean, on one hand, we cannot say, you have to take more responsibility, but on the other hand, we will tell them exactly who should be in a monitoring committee. You have to find the right balance. We can always recommend the member state, we can always insist that they take the right representation in the monitoring committee, but we cannot force them.
Okay, thank you. CEMR, please, and then we have also.
Yeah, thank you for confirming that the CLLD will still benefit from multi-funding. Does that also apply to integrated territorial investments? And just to precise that, I would be also interested to receive the answers on the question on the link with cohesion. Yeah, thanks.
I suggest that we come back with an answer to all the specific questions, because we are really over time. So perhaps, please. I can't see the flag.
Yes, thank you. Katerina Brubova here representing Kopako Czeka. Well, I had a couple of follow-up questions on your presentation. You mentioned strengthening the generation renewal in the new CAP, and I wonder if you could go a bit more in detail about this one. I mean, I do see in the proposal that one of the specific objectives is aimed at the young farmers, and also that the member state will need to pay specific attention to this. But then, on the other hand, when I look at the ring fencing, at the 2% support to young farmers, and to the fact that the measures both in Pillar 1 and in Pillar 2 are voluntary, and so somehow it gives one the idea that the member state can choose to forego one of the support in one pillar and to transfer all the money to the second pillar and to give all this money in this pillar. It doesn't give the idea that indeed the policy will be strengthened for the generation renewal, and I can say also this for SEJA as they are also quite concerned with this. My second question is on the communality of the policy. I mean, when you present the level of flexibility which will be given to the member state, it gives one the idea that the policy will indeed not be one CAP policy, but rather 27 different CAP plans for each member state. And I wonder if there is some sort of idea for the Commission, how will you go on to safeguard this communality? I mean, in terms of the process of the approval of the CAP plans. And my last question is on the you also mentioned this in the presentation, on the support to Life and Erasmus program. I mean, the wording in the proposal is rather vague. It's mentioned only in one paragraph, under one article, and it does say that the Pillar 2 funding can be used to leverage support and enhance those projects. And I wonder if you could explain a bit more how this should go. As indeed, if you would imagine that for us, the idea that the Pillar 2, which has been decreased, should support other policies, which has seen an increase of the budget, it's rather worrying, I would say. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the generational renewal. So in this period, I mean, we had currently in the policy elements for supporting generational renewal in both first pillar and the second pillar. We thought that in the new period we should propose a much more, let's say, comprehensive and coherent approach. And we have introduced a compulsory minimum level which is 2% of the equivalent of the first pillar. It doesn't mean that the 2% should be spent into the first pillar. It can be spent in first, second, or both. But there is at least 2%. Each member state, they should spend at least 2% of the equivalent of the first envelope for generational renewal. This is the minimum. So the member state, they can go much higher. So then there are different possibilities. First, in the first pillar, they can do this redistributive payments. So they can give to the younger farmer a higher amount per hectare to top up on what they receive as a normal direct payment. And of course, they should be young farmer. And then we wanted to simplify, so we only use the age and the education, the qualification request. In the second pillar, we have increased the minimum, the lump sum support to 100,000 euro. And we try also to simplify, then we don't put all the requirements, what should be in the business plan. There should be a business plan, but it will be for the member state to decide when we'll start, what should be in the business plan. But then there are other elements we have added in the policy. For instance, we offer the possibility of a young farmer to purchase land under the financial instruments supported by the EFRD. This is an opening which we are making. And of course, they can use all the other type of interventions. I mean, investment is always there for them. They can add on a number of elements from the CAP first and the second pillar and make a nice package. And it will be up to each member state to decide what they put in this package in the CAP, CAP plan. We don't want to tell member states you should put this in, but they should at least have spent at least 2%, and then a whole range of issues they can spend. Then this is not the only story. So there is much more. We want the member state to put in the plan a stronger interrelation and link with their national policy. We know in many assessments we have done, it appears that access to land, access to capital, a lot of elements which pertain to the taxation policy, to the inheritance law, and to many things which are in the national policy, they should also be taken into account. And they should be put into the plan other elements which are coming from the national policy, and to make this, to create an enabling environment for the young farmer to set up. So this is what we wanted to tackle, this generational renewal. And of course, we already have a first discussion in the council, and there are member states saying, oh, 2% is too much for us. And we are the opinion that no, I think we have looked into the figures, and I think the 2% is a reasonable amount that each member state can reach at least. And then there is scope for more. There were other member states saying, oh, 2% is not enough, but we said this is the minimum. You can spend much more. So this will be the compulsory element, and then all the others, they should be packed in such a way that they will facilitate the generational renewal. Communality of the policy. It's a long story, and there are many elements. So first of all, we decided to fix in the EU regulation a number of elements which apply across the board to all the member states. So for instance, we have definitions. We have common definitions which apply the same to all the member states, and we have framework definitions. For instance, we want to support genuine farmers, but what genuine farmer means in, I don't know, in Germany or in Ireland, it might be a bit different because of the different context. But we leave this to the member state. But we want all the member states to support what will be a genuine farmer in their own context. The conditionality, we have a common framework. Everybody has to apply the same conditionalities. Of course, they will be translated. And there is no, we have a much complex and complicated framework in this period where we prescribe everything in the EU legislation. If we take the GAEC, the Good Agricultural and Environmental Conditions, they apply differently to each member state, but we have a fixed number of GAEC for each member state. So they will take them, they will have a GAEC on water, on soil, on air, and they will have to translate them to their situation. We have a lot of, I would say, reactions first when we said we should have winter crops or not plow the peatland or the soil, carbon-rich soils. And then we have immediate reaction from the member states, which who has a lot of such situation, and says, but that means that we're going to introduce a lot of restriction. We said, no, it's for you to decide how much you want to protect these soils and to set up the national standards to protect this soil, because the interest is that you protect these soils because they contribute to the climate change and they store the carbon. And then, you make the definition. You see in your national context how to translate this in something which makes sense for your member state. Then we have the same type of intervention. Of course, they can be adapted to each situation of the member states. And we have a lot of elements which are still common. For instance, all the member states, they will still have to observe the WTO rules. So when they set up different type of intervention, they should stay with the compatibility of the different boxes of the World Trade Organizations. And we are going to check this at the Commission level. So then we have, ring fencing and elements which are going, and all these elements are going to be checked by the Commission. We have common set of indicators. When we are going to approve the programs, we are going to see if it makes sense, the indicators and the targets they proposed by each member state, if they are really ambitious, if they can be reached, and we have the same set of indicators. Of course, they can also add the specific indicators, but we would only look to these common indicators for keeping. And there are many other elements which can guarantee us the commonality. Now we are a little bit split between a complaint saying, there is a risk of the renationalization of the policy, but on the same time we have many member states complaining, you put too many elements in the proposal, which makes the subsidiarity not possible. And I think we are now in a situation, we consider that we have a balance where we have enough element to maintain the commonality of the policy and in the same time to give subsidiarity of the member states. Of course, this is a proposal. We are going to discuss this in a co-decision. We are going to see how much we adjust these elements. And of course, our main objective is to maintain the common aspects of the policy. And the last point, it is how the support to LIFE and Erasmus. Well, we have introduced at the Commission level this approach of seal of excellence. If a project is selected for one of the programs and has a kind of a seal on it that it's already assessed and it makes sense for the point of view of a certain objective of the EU, and there is not enough money under this program, this can be taken up and financed by another program without going again through a process of reassessing, re-evaluation. But this is left on a voluntary basis to the member states. So if member states, for instance, they have very good LIFE-like projects, and they have been tested under the LIFE program, and they were working properly, and they want to replicate this under the rural development programs under one of the commitment type of intervention that exists, then they can do it. They just simply say, I want to continue to deliver on this kind of LIFE projects through the rural development program. And this will be optional for the member states. And the same will happen for Erasmus. So if there are, we want to encourage mobility of young farmers, for instance. And, if there is not enough resources for Erasmus, under the Erasmus, member states, they can decide, we go and finance them under the type of operations we have under the rural development. And this will be possible. So this is why we are not very, very explicit and developing much more, because this will be left to the member state to decide. But this is possible. So they know that they can use this.
Thank you very much. And I don't see any more questions, so we will conclude our meeting here. Thank you again. And the minutes of this meeting will be transmitted to the European Parliament and the Council as usual. We will come back in writing on the specific questions which we could not address here. Also, if you have any additional questions regarding any of the presentations, feel free to send it to our functional mailbox, and we will also come back on those questions. And all the presentations will be available on the group's page on InfoRegio. We will do the maximum to put it on the site as soon as possible. Our next meeting will take place in the autumn. And already now, if you have any suggestions for the agenda, we welcome them. You may send it to us basically anytime soon. And as you know, the negotiations with the co-legislators are ongoing, so I am sure that you will be also informed over the next month, and we can also take stock at our next meeting in the autumn. So thank you very much again. Unless you have any other questions now under AOB, we close this meeting now. No questions? Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.